And
Yeah.
so this got me thinking, though, we should probably start proper. So
Sure.
the podcast always starts the same way. It usually goes like this, which is, where are you from?
Originally, Birmingham, Alabama. Currently, Scottsdale, Arizona.
So that's news to me. In the time that I've known you, and also then in the show prep, I had no idea that you had a connection to Alabama. So you're
I
born in
do.
Alabama, and then there are a
Yeah.
handful, a lot of other stops along the way. So how long were you in Alabama?
So I was born and raised there. So I
Okay.
spent basically till I was 18 there. At 18, I was, I would say I was a musician more than a student. I studied classical music. I was a French horn player. Got to the end of high school, started getting to the end of my junior year, started to realize that every college that was reaching out to me wanted me to be in their music program. I was kind of didn't want to be in their music program. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so like a lot of kids from Alabama whose parents had been in the military, I joined the Army. So I ended up in the Army for 8 years, did that. And then when I got out of the Army, I got out of the Army in Hawaii, but decided to go to University of Washington. So that's what ended up taking me to Seattle. And that's where I lived the vast majority of my life is in Seattle.
I mean, I'm just thinking about that contrast, from sunny Hawaii to sunny Seattle. Was the university what attracted you to Pacific Northwest?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's a weird story. So the military, the way it works is they will, when you leave the military, they will fly you back to wherever you entered the military from, or any distance shorter than that. So the idea being that since I was from Alabama, they would have flown me from Hawaii all the way over to Birmingham, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, I need to go to school. I need to finish college. I had about 3 years of my undergrad done, and I knew I needed to finish. And so I started going around, and I got my list of colleges together. I put all my applications in, and my first stop was University of Washington. So I went to University of Washington, and it ends up 2 or 3 of my Army buddies who had ended up at Fort Lewis had gotten out there and with the UW. So I ended up going there. I was supposed to spend 2 weeks traveling all over and going to all the different universities I'd applied to. Actually, at that point, I'd had several acceptances. I was supposed to go decide between them. And the actual reality was I moved to Seattle, loved it, loved the UW, never went and looked at another college after that, which is probably, in retrospect, not smart. Because I got into a few pretty decent colleges, but UW was home almost instantly. I loved Seattle. I loved everything about it. And so I never left. I spent 2 weeks hanging out with my friends instead of touring other colleges. And then I just accepted the UW and started going there.
Especially if you show up in the summertime, it's a hard place to be, I get that. So I want to talk, if you can, for a minute about your military experience. So you said, how many years were you in the Army?
A little shy of 8. So I went in, here's the real story behind how I ended up in the military, just because it dovetails into this. The Army was recruiting me heavily for the military band program. And I was dumb. I didn't know anyone that knew anything about the military band program. And I was just kind of like, I don't know if I want to do this or not. So notice this. If I wasn't an idiot and knew what the military band program really was, it was stupid to have them recruiting me and not to have taken it up. But let's put that aside for a minute. So I was fortunate to have good ASVAB scores. They basically said I could do anything I wanted to do. My dad had been in the old Army Security Agency, which is the predecessor to the military intelligence. And so I ended up doing intel. I went in as a linguist. I was assigned the Korean language. I remember I got assigned the Korean language, and being a good old boy from Alabama, maybe I should have known that, but being from Alabama, let's just say geography was not my strong suit. I knew all the states below the southern, the Mason-Dixon line. I kind of knew some of the Northeast, and everything else was kind of the middle. And if you told me to pinpoint like countries on the globe, that was not going to be a strength of mine. So I remember when I found out I was assigned to learn Korean, literally at the point, the only thing I knew about Korea was that's where MASH took place. Other than that, I couldn't find it on a map if you told me to. So Alabama boy ends up studies Korean for a year, ends up living in Korea for 2 years, working as a linguist. Left there, went to Hawaii. I ended up with an injury. I had some severe damage to my right shoulder, and that kind of ended and I probably would have at least stayed in for longer than I did, but that ended that career. And that it ended in kind of an abrupt way. I found out in essence over the summer that they were going to discharge me as soon as they could, but they didn't know when. And that prompted this whole like rapid, okay, start applying to every college I can apply to that I think is interesting. And then by about, I guess it was September, they told me, yeah, you're probably going to be out. I'd missed the entry deadline to start for fall, but most of the colleges had said I could start in winter. And that was the trip to go do my tour, which I ended up not leaving University of Washington and ended up staying there. But military service, yeah, it was a good time. Still keep in touch with a lot of friends from that era. But yeah, I mean, it was formative, but it was something I learned a lot from. And there's a lot of personal discipline and self-discipline that comes from that experience. Long term, I'm glad that maybe my career was cut short and I ended up doing other things. I think I've done all right in other arenas since then.
Absolutely. I can't imagine a scenario where living overseas for a couple of years, doesn't really shape your
Yeah.
your worldview in such a large way.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything that stands out to you as looking back from there that, this really helped impact me quickly and in a way that really influences who I am still today from just that experience overseas?
Yeah, well, very, very much so. I mean, I think that experience, first off, it's kind of weird. You grow up in the South, and of course, I've traveled around the U.S., but I've never been out of the U.S. At that point, when I joined the military, I'd never been to Canada, never been to Mexico, never been to the Caribbean, been in the U.S. my whole life. So that was joining the Army, getting shipped off to Korea was a weird experience, but. Because we were linguists and because we were taught a lot about culture and were given opportunities to learn more about kind of the people, and because talking with people was interesting and trying to use our language skills was interesting, I spent more time in the culture. I did meet my first wife in Korea. She and I ended up getting married. So I married into the culture on top of everything else. And I think that did a few things for me, especially when I got back to the U.S. Growing up in the South, I'm technically what would be considered by age to be the New South. And the New South means we grew up with integrated classrooms. It does it, and I'm just in it. If you go to my brothers, they grew up with segregated classrooms or at the beginning of integration. I grew up with integrated classrooms. And so, I already had a little bit of a different mentality than I would say traditional Southerners had because I grew up in multiracial environments and multiracial schools. But I still didn't have a strong formed sense of like inequity or inequality. And that really happened when I got married because watching my ex-wife and my two daughters, my older two daughters, you get to live firsthand with that sort of, it's not sort of, it's real. I mean, with the racism, you see it all the time. You see the stereotyping, you see the fetishization, especially with my daughters. And it definitely changes your worldview. And as you know, simply because of how we've met over the years, is that, I spent a lot of time in international roles since then. And so I have a very different view of the world, I guess, than a lot of people do, just simply because I've experienced, I think the last count, I did a rough count, 64 countries. I can't even count the cities at this point. And that's at least having spent more than one night. That's how I count nowadays, because there's a lot of cities I've been in for a night, but 64 countries. And yeah, it's really eye-opening. And I think it broadens your horizons to how things can work in different ways than maybe you're used to, which is interesting. And just, it showcases a lot of how different people live different lives and take joy and satisfaction from lives that we are very distanced from, that may seem very foreign to us. And yet they can do it without some of the first world niceties that we have and still live these wonderfully fulfilled lives. And you start to realize it really shines a light on consumer culture. Not that that's absent from a lot of other countries, it's there as well, but the more you spend time with people of all socioeconomic classes, the more you start to realize how some of those things aren't really as important as we tend to make them.
That's so true. Gosh, I mean, I really like the way that you said that. I think a lot of people would agree with what you just said, myself included. And also myself included, I think I still have a tendency to strain, for some reason, to chase after this consumer culture, like you said. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, if you have any thoughts on why that's the case. Like, I can't think of a better way to say it. Like, if we know that we don't need all this stuff to be happy, but we're still always just chasing this stuff, like, I don't know. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think you're hitting what is in essence an interesting societal theme right now, which is, okay, I'm going to maybe take a step back and say this in a slightly
Sure,
different way.
please.
You know, markets demand of companies this never-ending growth. Practically speaking, if you just put your practical hat on for a minute, you start to realize that never-ending growth is really not an advisable state to be in, and it's not probably great for anyone, because that pressure to create new avenues or that pressure to find new ways to sell products, even though people may not need them,
Mhm.
stems from this need for ongoing constant revenue growth. This artificial expectation that you must, if you're not growing every single year by N amount, you're just
Mhm.
failing as an organization. And a lot of that comes from going public, being a publicly listed company, blah, blah, blah. But if we take that for a moment, what you start to realize is that there's this incentive to companies, especially Western companies, more so. I mean, it's everywhere. So I'm not trying to be specific to just Western countries. I'm just saying it's more visible in Western countries. And it's this idea of the fear of missing out. You got to get the next big thing. You got to have the next iPhone. You got to have the next thing. And you start to realize when you're not living in that moment of, oh my gosh, I've got to have the next best thing. And you start seeing people who don't live that way, and you realize that they are happy, possibly happier in
Yeah.
some aspects of their life than we are, because they're a lot more just content with what they are. That one of the things I think we've lost just as a society is the ability to be content with just being quiet and still for a minute. And that still exists in lots of other places. And so you just find people living very good, simple lives. And I'm not talking like the poor, they can't afford it. I'm talking about, middle class people that just don't feel the need. I mean, one of the most telltale signs, I think, is if you just look at the size of houses between what they are in the US and almost anywhere else in the world. And you just start to realize how it's all about the big, it's all about the show, it's all about this externalities that aren't real, that cause us to behave in certain ways. And then when you get exposed to other cultures that don't prioritize things that way, you start to realize that we've created a lot of this ourselves. A lot of it doesn't really exist. We just make it ourselves. But to satisfy never-ending growth because financial people say if you're not growing, you're dying. And we could have longer conversations about that, but it's just an interesting distinction in culture between how people operate.
It is. I find that when people are able to distill to a couple of specific data points that they usually have like a framework behind it. So right now you were just talking about how that you were just talking about how we've lost this ability to be still and sit
Hmm.
in quiet in some points. And so my hypothesis here is that you probably have an intentional practice of some sort around that. And I was curious if you want to share with me about just how you either generally focus on that or how, or if it's just, something that you do like, acutely, um, to, to bring that into your
Yeah.
life.
Well, I think the common theme in my career over a long time has been I create and build things. One could stray, I invent things sometimes. I have invented things. And so, but that's what companies that I work for have typically put me in roles to do. Go invent a business model, go invent a business, go invent a framework, go create something, figure this out. And so I am sensitive to what it takes to be creative in a true sense. And I feel, I'm getting to your question, I hope. I feel a big part of that is synthesis, but also a big part of that is just processing and thinking and just being quiet with yourself for a bit. And I think we tend to try to kill that a lot as, I don't want to be in my own thoughts. I want a dopamine hit, flip through and dopamine, or I want to, oh my gosh, I might have missed a message. I better hurry up and check my text messages just in case. And I don't know. I mean, in my personal experience, I feel that that's distracting away from the ability for us to think broadly, think creatively. I think, I know for me personally, those types of interruptions are counterproductive for me. It causes me challenges in getting things done, right? And a lot of what I need is focus time. And so the answer to your question most directly is I plan focus time into what I do. And I've done this for years. I get up early in the morning. Typically I'm doing something by 5:30 to 6 in the morning. And for that first hour or so, that's all I do. It could be reading, it could be drawing, not drawing in a real sense, but like diagramming things I'm trying to figure out. It could be, sometimes it'll be consuming something, like consuming a lesson, because I find synthesis works best when there's lots of input. You just need lots and lots of input. And so what I try to give myself time to do is to spend time on input. Just take in things, learn new things, how things work, learn how things tick. But then you have to couple that with some time to just process it and think about it and be quiet. Just kind of quiet down and listen to your own internal thoughts and sort them into something that hopefully you can turn into something that other people find useful and interesting.
I think that's really, I love that. Thanks for sharing that with me. My own personal thought is the hardest part for that is to find the time, to find the time to specifically, or let me say, to discipline myself to make the time to just really sit with my own thoughts. The other things are when I'm finding something to input, if I have a task of reading, learning, taking a lesson, like you said, those things, it's an active thing, but to really just sit still with my thoughts and to give myself time to process, I totally agree. That's so powerful. And for me, frankly, it's also the hardest one, which I guess maybe brings back to something you said earlier about your thoughts around discipline. And you mentioned how you learned a lot about discipline from your time in the military. And, is there an overlap there? Do you still apply some of those?
Very much so. I've written about this. I probably have videos floating around about it, but I'm always happy to talk about this just simply because I think it's so important, which is, people misunderstand creativity. There's no magical muse. I don't sit around and something comes from the cosmos and all of a sudden I get magic and I can do something. What creativity does for me is if I sit down and in a disciplined sense, and I do work on something creative for an hour every morning, and I do that every single day, then wonderfully creative things come out of that process. But it's very easy to say, well, you know what? It's about the muse. It's about the inspiration. And the problem is the muse and inspiration don't give a crap about deadlines. And so when you start to get into the reality of the world, it's that, no, I have to do this by the end of next month. And I can't sit around waiting for, inspiration or the muse to land upon me and inspire me. And so that means I have to do work. And it's through the discipline of doing work that you become more creative, or at least you're able to express creative thoughts better. But that is discipline. You're never going to get saved by inspiration. You're never going to get saved by motivation. Those are fickle mistresses, both of them. So the one thing you can control is your own self-discipline. And again, it took me a while to land on the exact thing I do nowadays, but when I'm working for big companies or have worked for big companies, I always get up and the first thing I do is something I call morning triage. And morning triage is I get up and do my email and I figure out what's important and what's not. But that's all I'm doing. I'm just prioritizing it. And then I'm like, okay, cool. Figured out what I need to do. If there wasn't a burning fire I had to respond to, then I shut that down. Then, now that my head's clear, I'm not worried about that. Now I sit down and I usually try to claim the next hour and a half or so for myself. That's my time. And that's when if I'm currently taking lessons in something or learning something, that's where I'm going to spend time learning. If I'm working on writing or something, that's when I'm going to spend time just brainstorming and writing. The old creative writing teachers have been telling us this for years, which is, set a timer for 10 minutes and just force yourself to write for 10 minutes. As much as all of us, I think, every time we hear that, think it sounds stupid, it works. And it gets you in that mindset. And then the discipline helps because the more you do it, the more consistent you are with it, the more your body just sort of knows this is my time to do this, and you get more and more productive during those times. But it doesn't happen session 1, it doesn't happen session 10. It starts to really click about session 30, 40, 50, and then the more you do it, just the more it becomes a regular part of your life. And I'll say one thing, you said finding time's tough. There's a reason I get up when I do. I get up before anyone else in the house does. I try to get up before the dogs get up even. And that's because I know the house is completely quiet. There's no distractions. And the one thing I can control at that point in the morning is my distractions. And I try to be as productive as possible during that first hour and a half to 2 hours of the day.
I really
before
like
everyone
that.
gets up.
I mean, that's smart. And I mean, so I'm guessing also then, because the your ability to get up early in the morning, that starts the night before, right? So do you also have a consistent,
Yeah.
you have a pretty rigid, or
Yes,
consistent nighttime routine? Talk about,
I
can you
do.
tell us about that? I want to hear, this is
You know,
interesting. Okay.
it's more, it's kind of a weird aside, especially for someone like me who spent most of their time out of any given time zone and traveling for a living.
Yeah.
I actually have it's a genetic abnormality or a defect that causes me to not get deep sleep in the quantity that I need. And
Okay.
so I fought this my whole life and whole career. I've been fighting this insomnia thing. And so what I really did was, funny enough, it was when I moved here to Arizona about 9 years ago, where I was really like, I'm going to really focus on this and figure this out. And so I started spending a lot more time on it. I started studying my sleep cycles, started being a lot more mindful to it. Being a nerd, I've got to be a little data driven. So, I'm on version 4. I started version 2 of the Aura rings, and I started using other tools even before that. And then I just have a routine. I mean, I go to, it's all about consistency. I go to bed around the same time every single night. I wake up around the same time every single morning. I don't really set alarms anymore. I just get tired and it's like, okay, I'm going to go to bed, and I get up at the same time, whether I want to or not, most every morning. So it's just that force of habit. Now, when I travel, it's harder,
Sure.
but it's always something where I have to take a step back and think about it and be like, okay, what am I going to do to try to preserve as much regularity as I can? And you try, but the reality is that's never going to be a situation you're going to win. You're going to manage it, but you're not going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just about, just minimizing the negative impact at that point, right? Just try to get
Yes,
back on track
exactly
and
it.
helm. Yeah. That makes sense.
Recoverability when you get back. How quickly can I recover and get back into my old routine as well? Yeah.
Yeah. Are you, what are your thoughts on, are you like a sleep with you said you don't need alarms, but do you sleep, do you have like a planner on putting your phone away at a specific time in the evening, or or do you just plug it in? It's not a problem for you, right next to your bed, or
I think, I was in a session the other day with a guy that I know, and he's like, raise your hand if you think you could go a month without a phone. And I raised my hand, and he started laughing, and he's like, yeah, no one can really do that. And I was like, you'd be surprised how little I actually do with my phone. Like, a phone for me is like, well, first off, okay, I'm going to be very honest about this. My eyesight is not as good as it used to be, so let's just start there. So,
okay.
so I'm not a lover of small screens anyway. Small screens are not my friend. I would rather be productive on a laptop. But my wife is still at the point where she's like, I got to do something. I'll just do it on my phone real quick, and I'm like, oh, I got to do something, and then I immediately go find my laptop because I'm not going to do it on my phone. But I just don't. I'm not as I don't do social media outside of LinkedIn. So I don't, there's no Instagram on my phone. There's no TikTok. There's no Facebook. There's no X. None of those exist on my phone. I don't use them at all. And so I'm not tempted that way, which leads me to email monitoring, text message replies, maybe a game or two. And so usually I'm watching TV and just winding down by 7 o'clock. Come nine
Nice.
o'clock, I'm tired. I might be watching TV. I'm not really on the laptop or on my phone at that point. And then usually I move into bed, and then I have like a shutdown routine in bed that I go through so that I'm typically asleep by 9:30. So I just follow a lot of it. A lot of it is, which my wife sometimes gives me a hard time. She says I'm very much an old man now, but a lot of it is routine. But
Yeah.
but I take it less as I'm an old man, more as routine is healthy in this particular case.
I mean, look, two things can be true, right? I mean, you
Two
can
things can
like,
be true.
like,
That's true.
yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
very much so.
the routine is so powerful, and I also think,
Yeah.
I think we call it routine, but there's an aspect of discipline to it, because it's
Yes.
easy to, you can create good and bad routines, and I think, I don't know, I think there's something to that. With your social media, did you kind of just, we're right on kind of the bubble of when social media kind of developed. And so like there are certain aspects to it that I'm just, they're not my thing. And some of them, I've tried to be intentional about. But did you have to make a decision to like, I'm just not going to do social media, or was it just never a thing that became kind of part of your?
Yeah, so I had a beta invite to Twitter when it first started. So I had for a long time a very, very, very old Twitter account. I mean, back when there was no algorithm, and gosh, only people that were there at the very beginning remember Follow Fridays, where the best way for you to find someone was someone you followed on Twitter would recommend who else you should follow. So I was involved with that. I was involved in Facebook. I've done those things, but it's just, I started to realize what I realized about Facebook. Boy, I hope I'm not going to offend people who know me. Was, I kind of laughed at one point because I'm like, I left home when I was 18. I haven't lived in Alabama since I was 18. I really kept track of everyone there. And then all of a sudden, I've got all these people I went to high school and stuff that are my friends on Facebook. And I'm like, it's 25 years later. And honest truth is, I am so not the person they knew back then. I'm so not interested in the things that I was interested in back then. Most of what they post about, I'm not interested in. And I just found myself in this weird position. And this has nothing to do with like, you know, the horrible nature of social media. I just found it weird that I was seeking out relationships, and to a certain extent, you're trying to get likes and clout from people who, up until, you know, a few years prior, I hadn't talked to in 20 years and didn't give a shit about.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, why am I creating all this false social networky stuff that isn't that interesting or meaningful? And so I kept Facebook for a while, and finally I was just like, you know, I just don't, I'm not spending time on it. I don't find it useful. So I got rid of it. Twitter was pretty easy to get rid of, just because it was a cesspool, even before Musk. And now it's, you know, if you're still hanging on, I don't know why, but, so I got rid of that for a long time. Never did Snapchat, never spent much time on Instagram. I think I had an Instagram account, but just never really liked it. And so I didn't, you know, I'm not sitting here saying I studied all the science and I knew it was horrible for you, therefore I didn't do it. I just didn't, I don't know. It sounds weird. I just didn't get it. I
Yeah.
just felt like trying to maintain a network of people who I genuinely didn't care that much about. Was just a bizarre social construct that didn't seem that meaningful. And it seemed to prevent me from spending time with real people, which was even weirder. So I was like, I'd rather just meet real people. So I got off of it. Now, I do think you have to ignore a tremendous amount of research and science to think that it's good for you at this point, and it's healthy, considering that everything we know about how it affects the brain, everything we know about, you know, the challenges it creates, the stress it creates, even people fundamentally involved in it. The guy at Instagram that created Never-Ending Scroll has come out and said it was one of the worst things he ever created, one of the worst curses on the internet. You know, it's look, if you like it, go for it. I don't see any reason to be a part of it or to be on it. I say that, but then again, I maintain LinkedIn, so maybe I'm hypocritical in that way.
Well, hey, we, you know, we all have our, look, there's thresholds for tolerance, I suppose, is the way I'm thinking about it.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. And frankly, professionally, there are people who I want to maintain professional relationships with. And I understand the nature of that relationship is professional and business, and it's not, I don't want them on my Facebook. I don't want them, you know, knowing what I did this weekend. I want them to be professional relationships. And so I find that one thing that I do like about LinkedIn is the ability to keep a relationship professional. Just like any social media, you can make it personal. I tend to not try to do that on LinkedIn, but I just find that at least acknowledging the fact that you're maintaining a professional relationship, not a personal one, is useful.
I also find that, and I think it makes it more convenient. And, you know, I enjoy the content that a lot of my professional network shares. And so, you know, it's helpful. You hear what people's opinions are and perspectives of people that you value and respect professionally. It's nice to hear their opinions. Sometimes you want to hear it. So for that reason, I agree. I like LinkedIn in that way. Okay. So we took a little bit of a sidetrack here, but now back to the professional. You were, from the timeline perspective, you were talking about how we talked through your time in the military as a linguist in intelligence. And, you know, I had a question actually about the intelligence work that you did. I'm going to give a label here and tell me if I'm mislabeling you, but I would label you as someone who is highly analytical. And my hypothesis is that your work in intelligence also required a heavy amount of analysis. And so I'm curious if there's work that the work that you do now creatively and otherwise, if how those skills apply to kind of what you've done through other parts in your career.
It's different than you might think. So I was what's called a signals intelligence voice interceptor, which meant my job was to listen to North Korean radio communications and transcribe them. So that was my job.
Okay.
There was a second job, which was a sister job to mine, which was the analyst. And so they would take the voice intercept work and they would analyze it. Okay. And while we weren't officially cross-trained, meaning like I didn't go to the school they went to, there was a lot of, because that role also could be a linguist role, there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two roles.
Sure.
But the reality is, and this is a hard thing to remember about the state of the military at this time in the 80s, is that we were quote unquote a peacetime army, and I was stationed with the tactical units, which were ones that were not the, I wear my Class Bs every day and sit in an air-conditioned office. I was in the four-man team, hikes up the backside of a mountain and sets up a listening post on the front side of a hill facing North Korea type of person. So I had a little bit of a different experience than others who even had the same job, just because of the
That's
nature
cool.
of what I did, which was more tactical intelligence or tactical signals intelligence is what I ended up doing. Not by design. We all go to the same school, but then they kind of split you out. Some people go into more strategic assignments where they do a lot more of that analytical work and a lot more of the other stuff. And for us, we were doing that work. But what was interesting about it is not so much that work, but what it did for me when I left the military. And that was because I maintained my security clearance when I left the military. And so I vacillated in and out of public sector. And so it's interesting that the systems I worked on as a civilian were more interesting, required a lot more analytical thinking and a lot more than the actual work I did in the military. So I always joke, it's like the military was great. I didn't really have as much as intelligence sounds like an interesting field, my part of that puzzle wasn't great, but the clearance was very valuable. And once I got out, I always say I did way more stuff that was interesting and much more classified as a civilian than I ever did as a soldier. It's just the
That's
nature of the business, I think.
yeah. I mean that makes sense too. I mean, yeah. Is there anything that stands out? I mean, and that that you remember working on after the fact that you can talk about?
Well, yeah.
That's interesting. Or
Yeah, I'll give you a little chronology just as to how I ended up getting to where I got, which was,
yeah,
I was in grad school and I was working on my doctorate at the Human Interface Technology Lab at the University of Washington, which
okay,
was at the time, if you can imagine, this is early 90s, 93, 94 timeframe. This was a VR lab, an AR lab. It's the old days of very early AR, VR. And so I was
yeah,
a researcher at that lab. And what had happened was I needed to make money because I had a wife and two kids. And my $1,000 a month for being a research assistant didn't really pay much. And so I had to have a job. And so, and because I had studied education and I'd studied specifically curriculum and instruction, I built a little side hustle where I was writing training programs for all kinds of different organizations. And the funny thing was, I ended up writing, it was the police transport drivers guide for the Tukwila Police Department in Seattle. So this was this was, you load the prisoners up in the back of the van and then all the process for that. And that ended up getting me introduced to all these. So I was doing all these little training programs for police departments and and different sort of public service agencies for the most part. So, and so I was doing a lot of those. And then I got asked to work in this technology company called CyberSafe if I would help them write training, and I took that on as a contract. And what was interesting is they had anticipated the contract would take 6 to 9 months to get all the training written. And look, I was naive. I was just like, I just want to get this done so I can move on to the next thing. It was a fixed price contract, so I ended up knocking it out in maybe 6 weeks to maybe 2 months. And so I did all the training, gave it to them, and they came in. I was approached by the leader of their new consulting business, and he said, "Hey, look, we just realized something. You haven't written all of our training. You actually know everything there is to know about all of our products. Would you like to be a consultant?" And I was like, "No, not really. I've got this whole doctorate thing I'm working on. I'm about to start my dissertation." And they said, "Well, how about we just send you an offer? And you just tell us if you'll think about the offer." And I was like, "All right, that's cool." They asked me for my address, which I think they actually had, and I gave them my address. Next day, I get a FedEx envelope. I open it up, and it was an offer for $78,000, and this would have been 94 maybe. And I was like, "Holy crap!"
yes,
I was a soldier. I made $24,000 a year. I was even poorer as a grad student, and 78,000. So, so I took it to my professor, Bill Wynn, who's my doctoral advisor, and I said, "Bill, I got this job offer." And he picked it up, looked at it, and he went, "Oh my God, that's more than I make." And he's like, "Get out of academia. You can always come back." And I said, are you sure? I said, I really want my doctorate. I've been working on it for a long time. And the problem was that I had skipped my master's. I'd gone straight into the doctorate program. And so I was like, man, I've been doing this for 3 years. I'm going to have, or 2.5 years, I guess. I'm going to have nothing to show for it. He goes, we'll just, give you a master's degree, which sounded really sketchy to me. And in fact, the joke was until I went to the stadium to walk for my graduation, I was convinced that it wasn't real, but then they actually called my name. So it was real. So I ended up with my master's out of it, and then started working for CyberSafe. And CyberSafe was one of the very first computer security or cybersecurity companies that existed. And they were famous for commercializing the Kerberos protocol, as well as a lot of work in the public key space as well. And so being there was an interesting time. People forget, and this is kind of goes to travel, people forget that at the time, cryptography was considered a munition. You could not take cryptography out of the US without an exemption.
That's
This is the early
interesting.
90s.
Wow.
And so CyberSafe had a special exemption called a KMI exemption. I don't remember what it stands for. I just know it was called KMI, a KMI exemption that allowed them to export strong cryptography to law enforcement agencies and banks. And I spent a large amount of my time at CyberSafe doing implementations outside of the US with law enforcement agencies and pretty much every major international bank, a global bank there was. So I got to work with people like the Dublin Garda, the Hong Kong National Police Force, several others that I think I can't say who they were, but lots of police forces around the world, especially nationalized police forces. And then Deutsche Bank, UBS, Credit Suisse, First Boston, the Northern Trust, Wells Fargo, Comerica. I mean, most all of the big banks I had a chance to work with, and a lot of them out of the country. So that's really what started that, working more and more in these international roles, and was all CyberSafe. And yeah, they were an interesting company. They were ultimately closed down. It was a 17-year-old company killed by the dot-com boom, which is weird. But yeah, interesting time. So I went from there, went to RSA Security from there, spent some time there. I was there when Security Dynamics bought RSA Security. So that was the transition from them being just a little security token company to actually being a toolkit and an API and a crypto company. And I worked on that side of the business. So I did, if you can imagine, going into the dot-com boom, what I was doing was these really short, go in, help someone implement crypto, get out gigs that were usually taking less than a week. It'd usually be 3 or 4 days, where I would go to a company, help them implement cryptographic protection in their software, and then leave. And I think in my RSA time, my friend and I tried to count how many companies we saw, because this was literally dot-com boom. I would get up on Monday, fly somewhere, be home Friday, dump my suitcase into the laundry, start the laundry, get it all washed up, pack it right back in the suitcase, Monday morning, take off again. And so I think the loose count is over a 2-year period, I saw 40 some odd companies. Very few of whom exist anymore. It was just the nature of the dot-com boom at the time. So it kind of grew up through all of that. Ended up at Microsoft after that for the first time. You met me actually at Microsoft the second time. So I spent the first time at Microsoft, I owned certificate services and a little bit of crypto API, and worked on that for the Windows Server 2003 release.
Worked with the product group.
I was in Windows Core security at the time. Yeah. And that was kind of the shift between Windows 2000 to 2003, and there were lots of server side changes that were made in that era. So spent a lot of time working on that.
But before we move on,
yeah, please.
I was actually just real quick. I know the term Kerberos, but I don't know what it is, and I wonder if you could tell just a non-technical layman's explanation for what Kerberos is.
Yeah. So if you think about authentication, and if you think about, what people forget is prior to around 95, 96, maybe even a little later than that, but I'm going to say 96, stuff was sent over the network unencrypted. Nothing was protected on the network. So if you went to log in, what was typically happening would be I would log in with my username and password, and that would get sent over the network. And the reason for that is a lot of the software at the time was emulating terminals that had been hard connected to backend systems. So for example, if I was doing a 3270, that was emulating what used to be an old hard terminal that had a direct serial connection to a mainframe. So a lot of these systems were designed assuming that the connection between the workstation and the server were completely protected,
Okay.
but it wasn't.
They weren't, sure.
And so
Yeah.
so MIT developed, a guy named Cliff Newman at MIT developed a protocol called Kerberos that solved this problem. And it solved it in a particularly elegant way. And so what happened with that is CyberSafe commercialized it. We did the first implementations of Kerberos across every major Unix flavor. We had the only versions that worked on mainframes and on mini computers. And then we did a Mac implementation, and we ultimately did a Windows implementation. But we helped Microsoft. We didn't do it for them, but we provided a lot of assistance to Microsoft when they implemented Kerberos as the authentication standard in Windows Server, I think 2000 is what it was. So it's still in use today. You use it probably every day and don't realize it. It's one of the major authentication protocols of the internet today. And so CyberSafe was foundational in it. I mean, without CyberSafe, we could make a strong argument that it would not have been as pervasive as it was, because remember that KMI exemption. The reason we were doing all of this work with banks and law enforcement is they wanted to protect logon, and they wanted encryption, session encryption between whatever the computer was in the back end. And at the time, we were one of the only companies in the world that could actually do that. And so that's the travel. Most all the banks I was seeing, it was because they needed that session encryption, and it was mandated by policy sometime. I forget the year, and that was causing everyone to have to invest in it. So it was a weird time. So we ended up having the protocol, the cryptography, all of the pieces at a time when it started to become mandatory. So that's why a lot of people still scratch their head over cyber not existing anymore. It's like there were all the reasons in the world why they should have, and just rapid growth and probably not spending smart kind of in the latter years was ultimately what did it. But yeah, they were huge. They were like one of the monsters in the industry back in the early 90s for a company that very few people have heard of nowadays.
That's incredible. A few folks I've talked with is around the similarities between the dot-com boom and then also with the AI boom of today. Do you see any similarities there? And I was just curious if you thought about that at all.
I think about it quite a bit. Is it similar? It's similar in the broad strokes. It's different. So the difference is the way AI is disruptive, and it's disruptive in a very different way. So that's where I think the comparison on paper at a high level, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of speculative investment into new companies. There's a lot of cash flowing around without really a lot of critical thought about what it's going into. I mean, good Lord, who was it? Was it the company that was valued at 1.4 billion, and they found out it was just 700 Indian dudes manually doing everything in the back end? There was no AI, but yet, it got 1.4 billion in valuation. I forget all the details, but
wow.
So we're
I
in
didn't
this
read about
weird,
that, but that's tremendous.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
The story is out there.
Yeah.
And they're a nice challenge, right? So it's like we're seeing the investments, but I think what makes it different is this, and I look at it this way: disruptions hit, whatever the disruption is, and it causes companies to sort of adapt to it. And the reality is that adaptation usually results in them creating complexity, whether they meant to or not. In other words, it's that change and adaptation that sheds complexity in organizations. And the more you go through, the more difficulty you have dealing with disruptions. And so if you look at it just from an investment market perspective, I think that, yeah, it mirrors a lot of the irrational exuberance, as they used to call it, of the dot-com boom. But if you look at how it's really hitting and where the confusion lies, it's hitting in a very different way. So, for example, like here's something you may actually recall from our time working together in the past, which is when I was at Microsoft, my first real introduction to AI, like genuine introduction, was when they did the prisoner recidivism project with the Chicago Bureau of Corrections at Microsoft. And that was actually a machine learning model they trained to predict recidivism. And that would have been, I mean, if I even finger math it, Jeff, it's like, geez, 9 plus another, what? That probably would have been 15 years ago. We were doing that, and then that was this model that predicted with inputs whether or not a prisoner was likely to return to jail based on the different programs they were in and other things is what it weighted it on. And then we did another one with, I think it was a public school district who happened to have done this massive project to convert their old historical education records, and they were able to predict dropout rates. And this was, again, 15, 16 years ago. And we forget that that was AI back then. That was AI. We just convolute AI as large language models. And so what we're seeing is this historic kind of success of AI underneath the covers that people don't realize. These trained machine learning models are all over the place. Linear regression's well understood, categorization's well understood. These are not new technologies. What's new is language models and producing real human readable text, right? Generating. And so what you're seeing is people skipping over all of the stuff that AI does really well, and they're jumping to the thing that's emergent. And then they're going, I don't know why all my AI projects are failing. I don't know why it doesn't work. And that's what's making this a very different shift, is because AI's existed for a long time. Your recommendation engines on most of your apps that you use are all machine learning models. That's AI. We've been doing this for a really long time.
That's a really good point.
But now it's the nature of large language models that has got people interested in this generative AI. And generative AI is a very different beast. And I think the market has very unrealistic and unthought through expectations for large language models, and assume that if a large language model doesn't do what I want it to do easily, AI must suck. It can't code. It can't, I tell it, hey, go code this project, and it won't do it. It must suck. Interesting. Well, maybe it's the language part of it that's doing a bad job, and maybe it's your input that's doing a bad job. Maybe it's your prompt that's doing a bad job. And so there's just a lot of FUD around a technology that has existed for quite a long time and has done really remarkable things that people overlook. So that's where I see the difference. The difference is that people associate AI with LLMs. AI has been very successful for many, many, many years now. It's quite good at what it does in certain applications. We're judging it against a recent application, which isn't the place where it's the best at. It's growing. It's going to get better. When people ask me about AI, I was just pointing out that today, right now, this minute's the worst it's ever going to be. This is the worst we're ever going to see. Whatever you're seeing today, it's horrible. It's the worst it's ever going to be. It's just going to get better. But I think societally, I think businesses don't understand how to use it. I don't think they know how to think about it. I think that there's a lot of firms, let's say, whose job it is to help people understand how to adopt new technologies that are doing massive disservices to their customers because they don't know either. They're just making stuff up, trying to get a position in the market or try to win market. And I think this is going to settle. And it's not going to, the investment side is going to be weird like the dot-com boom. But I think from a practical sense of like what AI really does for people, I think we're so early into that. And it's so misunderstood that, but it's going to affect us in very different ways than people are thinking it's going to affect us. That's where I think the biggest difference is. It's not going to be making all of our advertisements for us and generating all of your online content. That's not the interesting part of it at all.
I think that, I fully agree with what you said. Like, it's hard to say. Everyone has their ideas about where they think it's going to land, but I think the reality is whatever we think it's going to be, different people might have different kind of flavors of accuracy on that. But I think wherever it lands, it's going to look totally different than wherever we think it's going to land. I just don't think that we could predict. I think even if we look back to the way we viewed AI, when I say we, like the general public viewed AI, even like 3 or 4 years ago, like what we thought it would be doing, we didn't think it would be doing what it's doing now. And I think that when we look at it again in a few years, we wouldn't, we're not going to anyway, but it's super exciting. So do you have a hypothesis on where, do you have a hypothesis that you think of where you think it's going to go, or what do you think it'll be doing? And
I do. I have a very strong opinion on where it's going to land and what it's really going to do. I think I'd have to get, so we'll go business conversation for a minute just to talk about it. If we think about organizations and we think about how they think about strategy, we typically get to a level where people talk about business capabilities. If you believe the capability models, you'll see business capabilities, and then business capabilities can be supported by sometimes technical capabilities, sometimes other capabilities. Just depends on which version or flavor of that model you find is interesting. And one of the things I find kind of humorous about how people go at this is they go, I'm not going to look at a business capability. I'm going to look at a process flow or one little teeny component of this where I think I can shove some Gen AI in there, and I can make Gen AI do this one thing, and somehow this enormous process, I'm going to get this much, and I'm going to do something cool in Gen AI, and all of a sudden it's going to make everything great, and it's going to save. And I think that's such a ridiculously myopic way to look at that, because it's ignoring everything else we know. And if we go back and we look at the bigger portfolio of AI and all the tools we have available to us, and we look at the average business capability end to end, boy, there's a lot you can do there. I mean, how many times if this set of data comes in, I can predict this, do we need in a business capability? How many times do we have a bunch of things that need to be categorized effectively into different categories? How do we need the ability to sort or to think about things, or and so there's all these things that AI does that has nothing to do with generating random text, that can be applied to business capabilities in their current form using current tooling today, that is being completely ignored. So I believe, as an example, that marketing will cease to exist in its current form, and the business capability of product marketing is highly vulnerable to being completely replaced. I believe that a large portion of sales is completely vulnerable to be completely replaced. I think when you get to things like program management, and prioritization, all that stuff is likely going to be replaced. It will reshape IT operations. I say, as an architect and someone who's designed a lot of solutions, that the hardest thing about being an architect sometimes is we know what the right answer is. It's never about not knowing the right answer. The right answer is always knowable. It's about an organization's ability to get out of their way and get to the right answers. You just can't get there. You very rarely go to someplace and go, here's your answer, and they go, cool, I'm going to go do that. It's usually like, here's the answer. They're like, but this problem, we've got this way of doing it. We've got this ancient thing over here. We can't fix this. We can't fix that. So you always end up in a compromise. But at some point, AI doesn't need to compromise. At some point, it can understand all of those interdependencies and figure out how to get things normalized down to a simple point. So imagine if I take an IT landscape full of applications, different platforms, different operating systems, different programming technologies. What if I normalize all that? What if my entire enterprise IT stack is now all of a sudden containers and AI middleware combined with large data sources and data lakes? What if it's all completely flattened into identical technology stacks? Okay, what does that do to the organization? Does that reduce your overhead? Does that reduce your complexity cost? Does that reduce the number of people you need to maintain it? And those are the very real, not now, not tomorrow, not in the next year. Those are the very real, within the next 4 to 5 years, things we're talking about, is the ability to go into an IT organization and say, I'm about to flatten all of this. I'm getting you down to a single programming language, or 2 or 3, a single hosting stack, a single operating system, blah, blah, blah. And what does that do to the organization? So I think that's where AI has real life and real capability. It's not how it's being applied by most organizations. But the threat's real. The threat to, I suppose if I had to say it in a slightly different way, I'd say what percentage of the human labor or human capital in your organization is expended towards fixing inefficient, ineffective, or broken systems, or maintaining systems that are broken, or maintaining 5 versions of something, or maintaining, and then if all of that goes away, what does that look like? And I think people don't think about that. I mean, some people do. Hey, we need universal basic income and some of this stuff, but it's bigger than that. What we're talking about is a fundamental change in a lot of the cost dynamics of modern enterprises. And the question becomes, do you even need a modern enterprise?
That's a good point. Do you think we do?
I think that the threat to modern enterprises are going to be agile organizations that can operate with low to no complexity and can move in markets faster and attack markets faster than enterprises can, simply because of the behemoth nature of them. They can't shed costs fast enough to be cost competitive. They can't pivot fast enough to get into new markets and take advantages. So I do have this sneaking theory that we're going to see these, I don't know if they're small businesses. I think they're probably low-end, medium-sized businesses that are just going to be highly efficient and highly effective and are going to be able to go after enterprises, both in terms of cost, customer service, efficacy, simplicity, and if they choose to destroy them simply because those organizations by their very nature can't respond to those types of threats. It's, they just can't pivot on a dime, so to speak.
I mean, I could completely imagine a situation where that works out like that. I mean, with an organization having the benefit, especially those kind of middle-sized organizations, have the benefit of having a little resource, a little knowledge, a little stability, but also being a size where they can be really nimble and pivot and just address needs super quickly and adopt and change. Something that you said a minute ago that really resonated with me was this idea of human labor and capital, human capital and labor being a significant portion of that dedicated to just removing inefficiencies and big systems. That's so true.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many systems that are like connected, but only kind of, and they're only connected because there's a person between them. And so the sharing of information or process or whatever is just, there's an inefficiency and, put some labor to it. And then with the AI being able to solve it, that's going to be that. Yeah. I think that was for me, that was a really big light bulb moment actually. So anyway, I appreciate you calling it out.
I point this out often, which is like when you sit in a room and people don't want to do it, or they don't feel like it, or they can't get a project done, or they sabotage each other, and they're trying to defend their turf or their fiefdom. AI models don't care about any of that. That's a human thing that's usually fiefdom protection, or stay out of my turf, or don't belittle my value to the organization. It's that sort of a thing. And the reality is that it just doesn't care. And so if you just take all of these systems and all these things, there's always the person who seems to know where everything is and no one else does, whose whole employment is based on the fact that if that person leaves, no one has the history. But it kind of eliminates all that because I don't need that anymore. But then, we can get down a very slippery slope of then what does that do to people? How does that change that equation? What does that really do? Which is a much, much more complex part of the problem. But the reality is I think from what we know right now, let me say this as simply as possible. This is what we know right now. We know for a fact that Anthropic and Google and OpenAI are working on improving the ability of large language models to write software well. We know that's happening. We know that it's probably further along. In fact, if you're not going through the chat interface and you're using the API interface, you'd be surprised what you can get large language models to do in that regard right now, more so than people realize. And so if we know they're going after that market, their job is to replace human coders. They are absolutely 100% spending their time on that. It's again, it will inevitably happen simply because of the investment that's going in to make that happen. What does that do? What does it do if the coder now, because now it's not a human, can implement security properly and implement observability and reduce operational overhead? What does that do? And these are long tail things that are going to inherently change the workplace. And so in my mind, I think it blows up the enterprise model because the enterprise model becomes inefficient and not interesting, and potentially creates this opportunity for smaller, more efficient companies that are highly specialized to be able to go after markets and win, because it's really hard for big companies to compete against that.
That's true. When we're talking about kind of the personality of AI, and it doesn't care. Like large language learning models, they don't care about office politics or whatever else.
No office politics. Yeah. Exactly. No ego, no office politics. They don't care.
But there's this idea that I've heard some people talk about, an AI having values of some sort, what it does care about, or even developing values. Like, do you have any thoughts around that? Do you think that ultimately there's a situation that could develop where we have this, kind of apocalyptic scenario where AI just runs everything. Or what I hear from a lot of folks is that there's this scenario where AI thinks it can do things the best. And so it will do things the best. And so ultimately it just completely takes over everything. And then, we live in a situation where there's effectively not a need for humans anymore. Do you think that is a realistic potential in the future, or what do you see it?
Could it happen?
Yeah.
It can. It is within the realm of feasibility that it could happen. But is it likely to happen? I don't know, simply because I feel as if we know enough about certain levels of fail-safes that we wouldn't give up a fail-safe to an AI. At least that's my going in position. I could be horribly wrong about that. But I just mean that a lot of systems we have that do a lot of things on their own still have a human in the middle, because even well-designed systems might require someone to apply some critical thought, or maybe consider things that weren't available to the system that made the decision. So I think we're still in that world. And I think the challenge is that people are so focused on the AGI, and like when the AI takes over the world, part of the problem that they're ignoring the more practical day-to-day uses that we're nowhere close to yet, that are probably the first things that are going to happen. So I kind of feel as if there might be an eventuality, but we're really not there yet. And hopefully by the time we get there, we'll have better understanding of how neural networks really work, because we don't always understand how transformers and neural networks produce what they produce. And so we'll know more about it by then, hopefully. There'll be new paradigms for models. There's some being talked about now that are very different from the way we think about these models today. But then the bigger thing is, at some point, someone has to start thinking about governance and how governance works in these systems, and how to prevent them from making poor decisions. So it's a complicated problem that that gets sound bites associated to it too often. And I can't conceive of a sound bite that it does justice to the complexity of that potential problem.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's all the way fair. Thanks for even, humoring me on that thought. So we were talking AI, but we skipped around a little bit. I think the probably the last kind of place that we were on the timeline was where you were finishing you were talking about the end of your first time at your first stint at Microsoft. And so you said was SRA before or after that?
So I had CyberSafe, went to RSA.
RSA, thank you. Sorry, RSA.
Yeah, it's okay. Went to RSA, and then I left RSA. Actually, funny enough, I always laugh about this. I was recruited by RSA at the RSA conference when I was attending it as a Microsoft I was a CyberSafe employee at the time, and I was recruited to Microsoft at the RSA conference by Microsoft when I was there as an RSA employee, which I find humorous. But yeah, so I ended up getting recruited to RSA, and then I ended up getting recruited to Microsoft.
Okay.
And so, so that was good. I mean, I spent time in the products teams. I learned a lot about how companies like Microsoft build operating systems in these large projects. It was a good experience, but I'd been at that point primarily on the consulting side. And it was a little bit weird to be behind a desk and to be doing, hours in the day, just sitting there. And so I got that itch. And so I was offered an opportunity. When CyberSafe went under, a couple of members of the board of directors bought their IP. And at the time they had support contracts worth a lot of money, because remember all those international banks and law enforcement agencies? Well, someone had to support all those implementations. And so a couple of board members had bought out those support contracts and had started a company called CSS that was designed to kind of service those old customers, but they wanted to build new business, use that money to build new stuff. And so I went and worked for them, helped them build a specialty practice, which was really a crypto and kind of deep security practice. We were down to hardware security and those sorts of things. And then while I was there, I got approached by contract to help work on the P8 program for the Navy. And so while I was at CSS contracted me to Boeing. At Boeing, I served as the IA architect for the Navy's P8 aircraft.
Okay, the P8 aircraft. Wow.
Yeah. So it's the replacement for the P3. It's the sub-100 killer platforms. And I basically worked on what they call mission system security. So I was the architect responsible for designing the security of not the not the avionics, but the actual mission systems that went on. So this goes back to something we talked about, which was I didn't do that. My Army career wasn't super fascinating. My post-Army career got to be a lot more fascinating because
Cool.
I had this clearance level that was unique, and so I ended up working instead on the P8 at the time, and so I took it through. I still have my picture in my office. The tradition is you get the signed picture of the aircraft with all the people signed around it when you leave the program, and so I still have my program photograph of the airplane, and yeah, it was kind of fun. I got to hang out with the P3 pilots, got to do an up and down on a P3, and got to spend time in all of the simulators and working on the systems itself, and learn more about how those systems work and how they communicate than I probably ever wanted to know. But it was fascinating, and it was fun working on a program like that, where it's just a lot of unique requirements. And that's interesting simply because I had to work on, these are survivability systems. They're true 5.9 systems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we actually had a requirement that if the 737 airframe, if it got hit by a missile in the rear part of the mission system, that the front parts had to continue operating, and had to take over. And so we did a lot of very interesting, very advanced, very sophisticated things around survivability and resilience. And I say that just to say the reason I ended up back at Microsoft is they came looking for experts in real-time systems and 5.9 systems to work on what they called at the time their mission critical program. And so Microsoft came and recruited me to go back to Microsoft on the consulting side to work mission critical, to help write the mission critical reference architecture, and then to help do mission critical projects around the world.
And so, just to clarify, I want to make sure 5.9s.
Yeah.
That's that means 99.999% online all the time. It's not. It's close to 100% as you can get effectively.
Yeah, these are and this is critical of life systems, and that's why they run at that level. So the idea behind it is that little mistake, that little issue could cause people to die.
Wow,
and so you're talking about systems that are as we had to do formal proofing. All the code had to be formally proofed. There's a lot of work that had to be done to make sure that it was as reliable. I've never worked on a program whose bar was that high in terms of like code analysis and all the other sorts of things, even since then. But yeah, there's a lot of things that go into designing a system where every piece has to cooperate and work together. And of course, again, system malfunctioning causes deaths. People lose lives if the system doesn't work. So did we achieve 5.9s? It'd be an interesting conversation. Now that they're flying everywhere, it'd be interesting to find out. But I can tell you that was our target, and we did a tremendous amount of testing to try to make sure that the systems could operate at that level.
That's cool. That sounds like a really, really fulfilling and super interesting program to be a part of.
It was, I always joke, I said I knew a lot. I had to learn a lot about high resilience systems when I was building authentication infrastructures, because you can imagine if the authentication system for Deutsche Bank goes down, no one at Deutsche Bank can get into the systems. That's a big deal. So we had to build those as highly resilient systems. So I had arrogantly felt like, I kind of know this stuff. I kind of, I know a lot about high availability, high resiliency stuff. And working on the airplane was a doctorate in high resilience systems. I learned way more about it than I ever wanted to.
It's cool.
But it also served as an interesting transition for me, because I'd been in security up until that point. And all of a sudden, my knowledge of ultra high availability, high resiliency systems was more interesting and more valuable in the marketplace than all of my security knowledge was. And that was actually my transition to where I was doing more big picture reference architecture design and solving more complex problems at that.
I mean, that's saying something when you talk about the problems you're solving becoming more complex. So you moved into Microsoft. So then that's also your transition to Microsoft. So you moved into Microsoft. What time frame was this? What year-ish?
I want to say 2008, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. Because actually, you know what I realized? I skipped something, because I actually spent some time at Disney, actually, about 2.5, 3 years at Disney right before I went back to Microsoft. So Disney had actually recruited me originally because of the high availability stuff. Microsoft recruited me from Disney. Disney, if you don't know, oh my God, Disney was interesting. So fantasy football, people don't realize that like the internet group I was in ran fantasy football, the technology infrastructure for ESPN's fantasy football.
Yeah, I didn't know that,
Imagine the dichotomy. You're coming from critical life 5.9 systems to, oh my God, we want 5.9s because if anyone can't do their fantasy football, they actually had back then they had a stat where CBS Sports had a massive outage and they lost 60% of their fantasy sports players because of the outage and only ended up getting something like 25-30% of them. So they lived with this constant fear of fantasy football can't fail. And by the way, while I was there, that was the very first Dancing with Stars vote. So we did the very first vote ever in the history of Dancing with the Stars. And we streamed on the Disney Channel, Disney website, Camp Rock. And that was the first time they actually streamed a movie online via the Disney Channel website. It was at the time Disney was considered the second or third largest media company in the world. So you're talking about we had to provide these infrastructures to be able to support Camp Rock, Dancing with the Stars, voting, ESPN fantasy football, and all these other sorts of things. So yeah, I got recruited there primarily to work on the security layers for those types of systems, and then back to Microsoft to work mission critical. So I messed up my chronology there.
Thanks for correcting it. Those are the scale there. I mean, of those things are super, just completely different. I mean, to think about Dancing with the Stars voting, that's such a mass quantity. And I'm also thinking about streaming the Camp Rock because there's a lot of extra complexities there as well.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I don't know what year that was, but I mean, if you were lucky around then, maybe you had a DSL connection for people to watch it. And there was, just the cables to get that kind of information out there. There are a lot of infrastructure problems or complexities, I think, to overcome with that. It's not an easy thing to do.
It was fascinating because since these were first, ESPN was predictable. We knew ESPN fantasy football would have n number of simultaneous connections. That ran in a massive in-memory times 10 database that ran in memory just for, it was a really fascinating system. But that was predictable. When we did Camp Rock, this is the first time I'd ever streamed a movie in its entirety off of the Disney Channel website. We had no idea how big that was going to be. Dancing with the Stars voting, it was 3 times our estimate as to how many people would participate. Now, we had planned to scale it, but we had what we thought it was going to be and what we thought the high would be, and the high was significantly higher than the high number. The actuality was higher than the high number, which was fascinating. So it's just trying to figure out, how do you handle that? How do you do content distribution? We used intelligent traffic management back then, tons of CDA, content distribution network loading, all kinds of tricks just to make it work. I mean, there are things like you had to turn off certain components of the TCP/IP stack because the stacks we were using weren't fast enough and they would hang you did. I mean, there was just all kinds of tuning you had to do to even accommodate it. And so it was a great lesson, which really, when I go to Microsoft and they're like, okay, now we need to document, what makes something a high availability infrastructure. And so our team worked and we built the infrastructure, but rather built the model. But having the model doesn't mean anything if you can't prove it. So then the same group of us spent about a year traveling around to different types of organizations that had unique mission critical like problems. And then we would implement according to our reference architecture to make sure that actually worked properly. So it's interesting times.
That's cool. So at this time, did you also leave with Disney? Were you still in Seattle or did you leave?
No, still in Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in Seattle. So I did mission critical. The way it worked at the time was we were in what Microsoft services called COEs, and COEs were designed to be life cycles. So they're only designed to exist for a certain amount of time. So the idea was we would develop reference architecture, test it, transition it to the field. So our job was to make sure the field knew how to use it. And then once we had fully transitioned it to the field, we would shut down the COE. But whether it's a good thing or not, the same group would then go to the next COE. So I went from there to dynamic compute. So and that time I took over as lead architect for that project. So I was an architect on mission critical, lead architect for dynamic compute. That one got shut down because we were tiptoeing on a potential change to System Center and Azure. And so Azure at least read through. There's an algorithm I created around upgrade domaining that they experimented with and I think did at one point live in Azure. I'm 99% sure it doesn't anymore. So that was kind of a cool feeling. And then I went from there. I was asked to go help start enterprise strategy and architecture. So I went over to that team, helped build out the more management consulting focused or enterprise architect focused business. And then, to answer your real question, after that one, I was asked to go worldwide public sector services. That was the reload to DC. So originally what they asked me to do was move out there and take over state and EOP. So I took over Department of State primarily. And that's where I was working with the team at, I had about 47 people that worked for me at the Department of State. I managed that relationship, and then that went straight into worldwide public sector services. So I was pulled into that, and that's where we built the international because there's everything but the U.S. So international public sector services is what we built from there, and I did that all in DC. So I was living in DC at the time.
So you reload to DC. You're working in public sector, and you gave a little bit of a teaser about what you were working on, or a little bit of a summary, let's call it. But you did a bunch of other stuff while you were there too, right? I mean, your job didn't just end with your project at the state, at Department of State. What did you end up doing after that?
Yeah, state was interesting. So maybe just to say, I mean, taking that over was an interesting situation. It was about trying to get that account kind of where it needed to be. And I'm glad to say that I was able to do that. Partnered with Marko Simovic, a friend of mine and account manager. We were able to kind of get it to where it needed to be. But DC was interesting. Just while I was there, I really enjoyed taking advantage of what was around there. Did get back into more of the creative aspects. I did more writing. I did some comedy work while I was there. It was a lot of fun. And so just really took advantage of it. My wife loved DC. She really enjoyed being there. I was probably less enamored with DC as a place to live. And I did like it as a working place and for all it was there, but just DC itself is tough. Well, goodness, I always said the worst thing in the world that could ever happen to me would be downtown and someone would be like, hey, can you come to the Reston office and be here by 2:00 in the afternoon? And it was like, well, there's an hour out of my day. And then I got to get back home to Alexandria, which means another hour back. And so DC was a good time, but I can't say that I miss living there. I love DC for the DC stuff, but I hate DC for the actual commute and the life and the other stuff. It was DC, but good time. And so, yeah, we built the international public sector business, was where I spent a lot of my time, and that out of the country a lot. I think at that point I was out of the country usually 2 to sometimes as many as 3 weeks a month, and working with a lot of foreign governments at the time on some very interesting and very cool projects all over the world.
I remember randomly sending an IM to you about something. I don't remember what the IM was about, but I remember you saying, "Oh, I'm in labeling off the next 4 countries or something." I'm hearing it, and you were recruiting architects, in-country architects, and I just remember thinking, "Man, this travel schedule is intense." But also, I was thinking at the time, "Oh, that's really cool." I mean, yeah, what a fun opportunity. Go some really neat
it was a lot of fun. What we would do, just because it was convenient, we would base out of the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. And the reason for that is they had a hotel in the airport, and then you could get one hop to pretty much any European city from Schiphol airport. But the cool thing was you could just leave your stuff, go to the hotel, get a room, leave all your stuff in the room, get up in the morning, walk out, go get on the plane, fly to where you need to be, spend all day wherever you need to be. Usually, maybe dinner, drinks after that, which was very common. And then catch a flight maybe about 8:00, 9:00 at night, hop on that flight, go back to Schiphol, crash, get up the next morning, do the same thing. And so we would base out of something like Schiphol and probably hit 7 to 8 countries from there. Usually spending a day. Sometimes we would spend a couple of days there if we needed to. But what you're talking about really specifically was kind of an interesting time, because one of the nice things about our role was we were given a lot of leeway to try to find the right people. We weren't told you must hire people. They said, no, we're going to give you a head count and you can hire them. There's no geographic restriction, just find the right people. And so that put us in local markets, talking with people, trying to figure out who the players were and trying to find the right people. And we recruited this phenomenal team. I mean, I'm still very proud of the team. It was a phenomenal team of resources, very international, strongly capable, just experts at a level that few people have, and just brilliant people that you could put in front of a a customer anywhere, and you just knew they were going to sing and shine. And so it's just a ton of fun. But I think the big thing about that opportunity that I don't get the chance to say enough, but I think was really important, was it was such a good group of people. It was just such a phenomenal team. And we were just able to do things very fast at a super high quality, just because the politicking and the infighting really didn't exist. Everyone was there to really try to do the big things and make their mark in a good way. I don't mean like for my own self, but just solve really interesting, complicated problems. And so it was a really great team, and really a high point of my career was working with this really excellent group of people.
I think that, there's something to that. We look back on consistently as I've talked to people, myself included, I think that's a theme that I hear, is that the problems that we solve or projects that we work on, people love that. But even above that is just the relationships that we build with people. Yeah. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And this is a little bit of a two-part question, but as you look back on your career, and I know there's more to it, we'll cover it here in a second, but as you look back on your career, I remember something you said to me a long time ago was that, a lot of my career has been push rather than pull. People have reached out, and this, this is consistent with the story that you're telling me right now. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on relationships as a whole, and how you approach them. And then also from a career perspective, how you approach relationships. Obviously it's worked out for you, but I don't know, is that intentional for you to develop relationships along the way? Or is it something that it just kind of happened?
And it's a real lesson learned. I think it's hard for people that weren't there to really understand what was going on, like in the early 90s through the .com boom. And I say that because I wasn't doing what I should have done in that era. I mean, I was much more egotistical. It was much more about me. I was doing good stuff. I was getting a lot of customer recognition for it, getting a lot of recognition from my company for it. But, I wasn't afraid to let someone know if they were doing something stupid. And that was not a good thing. That was not a smart way to approach things at the time. I have my fair share of regrets from those times back then. But I think by the time I got to RSA, and certainly as I was transitioning from RSA to Microsoft, I was starting to see the fact of the matter was, security at the time was extremely small business, and everyone knew everyone. And I had my first message come back to me from someone that I hadn't been very nice to, kind of pointing out that I was a prick. And it hit me, and I was like, man, that's not cool. That's, having someone, you don't want someone saying that about you, right? And so it made me take a step back and start to realize a few things. And it just felt like, I need to start investing in the human relationships a little bit more. I need to start building those real meaningful relationships, not just based off of, hey, I've got a favor to ask, but just getting to know people a little bit better. And so look, I say this because I think it's important to know if you're that guy that's a little egotistical and all that stuff, there's still hope. You can recover. You can. I hope. I like to pretend I did, but a lot of it was just me realizing that those relationships were much more important, and they did. I mean, I mentioned I was recruited all along, and a lot of that it wasn't that I treated everyone poorly. It's just that I could have treated people better. And not just people that were interesting to me or people that were peers, and that took me a while to learn. It was really just trying to be a bit more human with people. And I think the other thing that really turned me on, and I was reminded of this by someone who taught me this originally years later. I had a friend, Tom Peltier, and when I first started in the business, Tom kind of took me under his wing. Myself and my friend Steve, he took us under his wing. And I kept in touch with him for years and years and years. And I would see him anytime he's from Detroit. If I happened to run across him or if he was on the road, I would meet him. And he said something to me kind of years after I'd met him originally, where he said, remember at some point, the reason you got to where you are is because someone stepped back and let you take over and let you run it and stayed there to help make sure you did it well. But they were supportive, not critical. They gave you that opportunity. And most people who've done well that have that person or have that opportunity where someone kind of said, yeah, I've got to let you do it. And he kind of said that. He said that to me. And I don't think he was saying it because he perceived anything. I just think it was Tom, one of his things that he knew was important, and he just wanted to repeat it. And I remember leaving that conversation kind of with a bit of a shift in mindset, which was up until that point, it had really been, it's easier for me to do it. I'm the expert. I know how to do it. I can get in, I can knock something out. I can do in, 3 hours what someone else is going to take 2 or 3 days to do it. But it really started to make me think that I had to start investing in people more, and I needed to start really focusing more on developing other people and building out other people. And so I can't pinpoint exactly the year that happened. It was probably at the end of my first Microsoft tour as I was leaving Microsoft to go into CSS. But yeah, it just made me really start to think more and more about how we need to, you hit a point in your career where it becomes more important for you to start to nurture and generate the next generation, and to start teaching other people and give other people those opportunities, and stop doing everything yourself, and stop being arrogant about, if I don't do it, it's not going to get it run right, or all those other not good things, not good ways to think or be. So yeah, so over time, it took time. And, I always joke, I'm in my kindler, gentler years right now, where I'm less interested in me and my accomplishments and that sort of stuff, and much more interested in learning from other people and talking with other people and helping other people where I can.
I think that's so important to recognize, in a couple of ways. One is just this idea of having someone have look, it's a kind thing to give someone a piece of feedback like that. Well, to your point, whether it was, directed towards you or just something you just happened to say, like it's a little bit vulnerable to share like a personal perspective like that. And it's also, gosh, it's so important, man. I mean, I really like that guy took the time and the opportunity to share it with you. Is clearly influential. Have there been other folks like that you think?
Absolutely. I mean, throughout my career, I always say, I think people who've met me later in life assume I'm some big engineer, or I grew up through an engineering program, and I, blah, 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 but I'm not. I'm a liberal arts major, with an education degree. I'm not this technical guru. Well, I always say I'm more technically knowledgeable than most people realize, but that's okay. But again, I'm not that person. So I had to learn that. I had to grow there. I mean, I relied on other people to teach me that. So through the years, CyberSafe was my first big opportunity. Tom I met there, but it wasn't just Tom. It was that CyberSafe, we had this collection of people that were some of the most brilliant security people that existed in the world at the time. I mean, and that sounds like hyperbole, but we had the guy that edited Frack magazine sitting in our engineering team. We knew Jeff Moss, who started DEF CON. We were in the early DEF CONs. We were, but those were learning. There were people who were super generous with their knowledge. I had a guy that had been one of the original guys that came over back in the early days of Microsoft. That Dave Cutler came over from DEC time frame, and he's the guy that sat in a cubicle with me and taught me to program C. Because I didn't know C at the time. And so, I look back on that, and I think there was I think even in our business as general, there was a lot more sense of giving. A lot of people really, but at the same time, RTFM was everyone's callback, which was, first read the manual, make sure you've actually done your homework. Then when you can't figure it out, come see me. But through the years, I mean, I've had those at most every company I've worked at, where someone's been a person that's helped me grow or given me perspectives I didn't have. And it's weird, because you would think you would seek those, but I think in my case, I've been just fortunate to land with people that had those skill sets and that kind of operated that way. And by example, had kind of helped me to understand how to act that way to other people over the years as well.
What's been your experience with so I mean, effectively what we're talking about here now are people that have applied some learning, shared some learning with you in some way, in a form of informal mentorship. Whether that's like a long period or a short period, or just people that have helped you along the way, helping you. What's been your experience, or has there been an experience related to this type of informal mentorship, these lessons learned just kind of on the fly, or sometimes the more formal mentorship? And I don't know, do you have thoughts on one way or another?
Informal's actually been better for me because of the nature of my travel schedule, and life and work has always been very chaotic. And so informal's been more important. I mean, right now, it's just a funny aside, but right now, this minute, I'm on a Signal chat with guys I've known since CyberSafe. And we're all late career with VPs and CTOs and all this other sort of stuff. But it's remarkable how much, even there, people come out and ask questions. hey man, what the heck is up with this thing? And we still share knowledge with each other. We still talk with each other. And yeah, we know each other. We did the math the other day. I think it's 33 years is how long we've known each other. And we still share information,
Man.
point people to people. Hey, can you talk to this guy for me on this topic? Hey, what do you think about this? And so that informal sounding board, that advice still exists. But it's informal and ad hoc, but I think that's also a nature of how long it's existed. I think if I went to any of those
Yeah.
guys and said, let's get a one-on-one on the calendar for Friday, they'd probably freak out. But if I just picked up the
What?
phone and texted them and then called them, they'd be like, cool, let's chat. It's just the nature of that relationship. But I have lots of groups in my, people in my life that kind of fit that way. When I need a perspective on something, they're people I can call and get perspective on. Even people, there's a few in the infamous Rolodex that I probably don't talk to as frequently as I should, but they're the type of people that I know, hey, I haven't talked to this person in 2 years, but I got a question and they're going to know the answer. I know if I call them, they'll answer the question,
Yeah.
which is pretty awesome too.
That is awesome. And I think, having the foundation of the relationship that you know that you can reach out to them, they can reach out to you is important. And knowing just them as a person enough to be able to ask them. And I think there are also people that you don't necessarily, you don't like, if you have that with them, you don't necessarily need or even want, I think you don't even always want to keep that type of relationship there because this is going to sound harsh, but you only have so much bandwidth within your life to have consistent connections with a handful of people. And it's okay if you're not having connections with every single person that's within your proverbial Rolodex, right? Some of them are people there and so I guess looking at this a little bit differently, my rule of thumb with the people that I generally try to keep in my close network or people if you wanted, if I know that if I could call you and you would ask me, I know that if I could call or message or text or whatever you and ask for a favor, then it would be likely a yes and vice versa. I think those are you just only have so much bandwidth. So I think it's smart, I guess is what I'm saying, to know that about yourself and the people that you're dealing with and working with and staying connected with that. Hey, you're there.
I think you said it really well, is knowing that there are people in your life that regardless of time or distance would take the time to talk with you when you need that conversation. And having those people around are super valuable. They're those people you trust, but they're also, and it goes both ways, right? It's those relationships are such that they know the same thing about me. If they reached out to me, I would do the same thing for them. So, agreed.
So you ended up ultimately leaving.
I did.
Leaving DC, right? And so did you leave DC when you left Microsoft at the same time?
No, it's kind of an interesting kind of career situation. So Microsoft decided, so if you realize when we started Worldwide Public Sector Services, we were the first real official industry vertical that existed in services. At that time, EPG, the seller teams had industry verticals, but services did not. And so we were the first one, and we kind of proved the model. We proved that you could develop industry-specific IP, the overlay model. So we did everything. And so overall, Microsoft was very pleased with us. We closed out, I think it was FY 2016, at 1.7 billion as a P&L. So we took it over. It was 700 million, I think, when we started. So over a 4.5-year period, we grew it to about 1.7. And so on all metrics, we were positive. And so they decided this was a good model. We should do more of this. And so they decided to open a role for not just public sector, but industry, all of industry. And I talked with them and they had agreed, said, come on back to Redmond. This is your role. So I'd actually gotten a new job. And so I had handed over the team to my number 2 at the time, who was Barbara Perry, who you probably know. Barbara had taken over the team. But then I had some family stuff happen. My wife's family and my wife's family is from here in Arizona. And so instead of moving back to Seattle, we decided to move to Arizona. In my mind I've been doing this job remote from DC for, forever. Where I am shouldn't be that big of a deal. I can fly into Seattle all I need to. And they actually, Microsoft rescinded the offer on my way to Arizona. They actually called me in the middle of my drive and said, we're rescinding the offer, which was awkward. But they said, hey, don't worry about it. You're a high
Wow.
performer, we'll take care of you. We'll find another role. Well, what had gone on in parallel was they just hired Kathleen Hogan's replacement, and they just gone through that reorg, and there were no open spots. And so, but they said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So we'll just,
Mm.
keep you on the payroll, and the first spot that opens up is yours. But it was weird. It was a weird place to be because I had nothing to do, and I'd been at Microsoft long enough and at a high enough level at Microsoft to understand the politicking and understanding that not having a job wasn't a good thing. So Amazon came to me, and they had decided to take the cloud adoption framework that had been a part-time community-driven effort at that point. They wanted to consolidate it under a single person. And with my experience with the kind of building reference architectures and growing them within Microsoft, they thought I would be a great person for that. So I ended up taking that role and going to Amazon. And so I left Microsoft after basically sitting on my hands for 4 months and I was getting to the end of the year, and I'm just like, I'm going to get cut. I don't have a job. I've been applying to internal roles. There just was nothing available at the time. They just literally reorged. And so I took the Amazon role and did my 4 years at Amazon. And there I basically rewrote the cloud adoption framework. It's the one that most people know now. It's the one that I wrote and spent most of the time running around the world teaching people
Wow.
the cloud adoption framework.
That's pretty, it's impactful. And I mean, yeah. The cloud adoption framework. I mean,
well, it's the first one, and that was what was really cool about it. Was when it was released, no one else had put one out. Microsoft started rushing to get one out as soon after that as possible. Google was doing the same thing, and I'm not giving Google a hard time, but I'm giving Google a hard time. They put out their first stab at a cloud adoption framework was based on the people process tools model, and it was like, okay, guys, this is nothing interesting. Maybe, but I just think it was not very helpful. And Microsoft, I think, ultimately got the investment they needed when they started. It wasn't as strong as it could have been, but Brian over there, and I was in touch. The irony of it is I'm in touch with all these guys. We were all talking behind the scenes, but Brian got the funding and he got the executive support he needed and was able to do more with it. And I just wasn't. Basically, I finally was able to hire 2 people after running the program for 3 years by myself. But we were understaffed in comparison to what the other companies were putting into it. So it was just, it was hard to keep up with everyone when everyone else was moving so fast. And we were constrained to whatever 3 of us could crank out as fast as possible. Started to become a little bit tough.
Yeah. So how long did that stay then? How long did you stick around?
I ended up leaving for reasons I've written about, and I'll probably spare you those details. I wrote a post that is somewhat well known on LinkedIn called "Why I Left Amazon," and that details pretty extensively as to why I left. Maybe I'll say it out loud. I don't consider Amazon to be a good company. I don't consider them to be an employer that cares about people at all. And I think that while they've attempted to try to pretend they do, the overwhelming evidence just continues to show that they don't prioritize people at all. So, and my experience there, as much as I loved the cloud adoption framework and what I was doing, what had become kind of crappy was that, people saw me as sort of like the conduit back to Seattle. And it was kind of weird because I would go to a place and I'd do my, my song and dance of cloud adoption framework internally. I'd go meet with customers, and usually people would pull me aside and they'd be like, man, we've got some stuff going on here that someone's got to deal with. And they would just go off on like, well, all these things that were going on. And you started to realize that the same thing was happening it didn't matter what country I was in or where I was or which part of the business I was talking to. Just the feedback was always just, a lot of issues with women, a lot of issues with people of color, a lot of issues with gay and lesbian community, really getting made to feel really inferior, getting treated poorly within there as more of a systemic problem. That's what you started to realize pretty quickly was it wasn't unique. It was a systemic problem there. And I kind of found myself in this weird position where it was like, I love what I'm doing, but I think this is probably where my mindset had started. After leaving Microsoft, I think that's where I really started to think a lot more about maybe the morals and ethics behind what we do for a living and what it means to be in public sector work doing IT, what it means to be in the commercial world doing IT, and how companies go about business. And I just was becoming very disillusioned with Amazon and frankly, the cloud market. I mean, I've written fairly extensively about it, but the cloud market itself is just another artificial market that is sadly doomed, yet is also too big to fail at this point. So I don't know. It's repeating patterns.
Why do you
You
say
know,
it's sadly doomed? That's
I've laid
interesting.
out the economics for it a few times, but I'll lay it out maybe with the modern thinking, with the current thinking on it. So if we look at cloud growth and what was anticipated with
Sure.
cloud growth, there was this anticipation that the addressable cloud market was going to go out. When you looked at most of the projections, it was a 10 to 15 years. We're going to see people. That's just what the adoption cycle was going to take before you kind of reach market saturation. But we had this
Yeah.
crazy thing happen called the global pandemic. And then we had the second crazy thing happen called global work from home. And if you go look, I always tell people, don't ever take my word for it, but you can see this in the numbers. Go look at the numbers, and what you'll see is with all of the major cloud providers, they had this huge dogleg happen during that time where their revenue growth went insane. And a lot of that was driven because people were being forced to
Yeah.
accelerate their cloud adoption or their move to the cloud. And so by the end of the pandemic, what you saw was them pull in the addressable market from a 10 to 15 year outlying addressable market to they pretty much cleared out that whole addressable market space. And so now there's less greenfield. There's less like, oh, this person needs to go to the cloud. It just doesn't really exist in the marketplace anymore. And so if you have Wall Street expecting you to constantly grow, but your addressable market is not there, and on top of that, a lot of your ARR, a lot of your revenue is being generated by lift and shift projects that were highly inefficient, and they're driving ARR, high levels of ARR because they're not efficient. And if those were made more efficient, the amount of ARR they drove would actually decrease. So then you see features. I need to go features. I need to do this.
Makes sense.
And it's just creating this unsustainable market. But here's the thing that should scare everyone. The closest numbers we have is about 2 years ago, there were a lot of analysis that came out and said about 66 to 67% of global compute happens in 3 hyperscalers right now. So that means if you have AWS, Azure, and GCP owning 66 to 67% of all compute in the world, that means that if they change prices and their customers pass price changes to their customers, then they have an inflation control lever. This is one of the first times, historically this has happened before, but one of the first times in recent history where we see 3 companies that have absolute economic dominance to the point where they can actually impact things like inflation rates within countries. And that is absolutely insane to think about. That is absolutely insane. And maybe just to extend that for a second, one of the big issues you're seeing with why the hyperscalers care so much about AI is if they miss on AI is going to eat a large amount of their ARR. And if they are not getting new ARR for something else like AI, this is going to screw their numbers up. But at the same time, what we're seeing is with this consolidation, we're seeing us continue to give major economic levers to 3 commercial entities. Three entities. And so the percentage of global compute they're going to own will continue to go up, probably not as fast as it has been. Meanwhile, if you're in the field dealing with this, what you're seeing is cannibalization. What you're seeing is Amazon or AWS in particular offering incentives to buy ARR hosted on other CSPs or other hyperscalers. So, hey, you're on Azure? Hey, we'll give you, instead of adoption incentives or rather old migration incentives, we'll give you adoption incentives, which are basically come to us, we'll buy your ARR and we'll handle your migration. So what you're seeing even now is the beginnings of cannibalization, where without this big, huge addressable growth market anymore, where you get revenue growth, you steal it from other companies, which is also unsustainable long term. So cloud has not been, and again, you just have to say it because I think a lot of people are a little naive about this. One of the things, and I say this because I've been personally involved in a couple of these deals where you were seeing large companies that own data centers migrate their stuff to the cloud. And one of the deals that they would make would be that the hyperscaler would buy their data centers once they migrated out. So the problem is there's nowhere to migrate out to. So you're in this really strange catch-22 where a third party owns your cost structure because you are required to host on them. So what we're seeing in the market is you're seeing, again, you've got hyperscalers cannibalizing each other because there's no addressable market. So they've got a couple choices here. They either have to release features that people will adopt. They have to somehow prevent people who are highly inefficient and who have high ARR burns from simplifying out of their ARR burn. And they need to get whatever new technology they can get on board. But the problem is we're letting this happen again. So again, we're letting this happen again. And so we're seeing AI start to get convoluted into the hyperscalers. And so what we're seeing again is we're becoming more and more dependent on commercial businesses who chase a profit, who have expectations in the market that they will continue to be profitable and continue to grow revenue, which is contrary to our economic interests in controlling inflationary rates and all these other kind of economic indicators that they now have a tremendous amount of impact and influence over. And you can imagine collusion in the cloud market to increase prices. And I'm not accusing them of colluding. I'm just saying, I don't think they would ever collude, but I do think they would be, I think if someone got away with a price increase, I don't think anyone else would be like, well, we're not raising prices. I think they're going to be like, we will increase our profitability or our revenue by increasing prices. Of course, we're going to raise prices. But if everyone raises their prices 1%, 66% of all compute just had their prices raised by 1%. And then all of those consumers, all those companies that consume that compute need to do something with that cost. Would they pass it along? Maybe. If they do, how does that hit the economy? Increase prices and inflation. So you end up, so I don't know. So we're in a weird world right now. We're in a weird world right now.
Yeah. And to your point of like how, there these, the consolidation of these companies, the cloud providers essentially, and how there's a transition from the use within the data center compute from traditional cloud storage to AI, essentially these large language learning models using up so much compute. Those are similar companies that are going to be there, right? So it's a continued consolidation of this giant resource and then the use of the resource as opposed to just, lots of these, so many fragmented, I'm just thinking of the massive number of companies out there that have compute storage with a large provider. If you take a piece of that and whatever the proverbial pie is, and you acknowledge that a piece of their compute that they're using within these storage is now coming from one of a handful of large AI providers, then that adds to the impact from pulling that lever.
Yeah, and the whole transition. If we talked before about if you follow like where the AI companies are trending and where they're going and what they're interested in. If we take be able to do real coding, if we take that to an extreme, imagine a world where instead of having our nice front end coded and ready to go, we just dynamically build that front end and customize it to the user on the fly because our and that, what happens when business rules and inferences can be codified in such a way that I don't need complex business logic layers anymore. And then what happens when storage flattens and becomes a little bit more, so what we're talking about is a potential future shift in sort of how we think about applications working in a very fundamental way. And the question becomes, where are those going to be hosted? Are we going to give all of that to the same three companies? Or are you going to see other places grow and new companies form? I don't have an answer for it. I just know that our economy is becoming more and more tied to the success of very few companies who have not always shown themselves to be companies that act with the highest of morals and ethics. So everyone needs to consider.
Thanks for giving me the breakdown on catching us up to this point. But, you've had an awesome career, but you're still working on a lot of good stuff. What are you working on these days?
So I started back in November. I started a new company as a startup. The idea behind it was to do something I was personally really interested in, but it's also a bit of what I would term sort of a capstone project. So I mean, you more than a lot of people know the shape of my career, done a tremendous amount of solution building and solution architecture throughout my career. And so this is really me taking all those things I learned about how do you make something excellent from a security perspective? How do you make it the most operational it can be? How do you use architecture practices and principles to really do everything as clean, as clear, and as well documented as possible? I'm sort of taking all of that and applying it to a problem I'm really interested in, and so what I've been working on is this concept that that people who do a lot of creative work can't really scale themselves well, especially people who are in the book writing business, or perhaps they're public speakers, perhaps they're consultants or advisors. A lot of that, whether any of us like it or not, becomes very personality driven. It's about me. People want to hear me explain. So when I worked on the cloud adoption framework, people want to hear me talk about the cloud adoption framework. If I'm working on something, they want to hear me talk about it. And while others can do a good job, they certainly don't have the nuanced detail that I have. And so the question's always been, how do you scale someone's knowledge? How do you scale someone's knowledge like that and put it in a form that people feel they're still learning from that individual, but they're doing so in a way that allows that person to scale? So that's the problem I've been interested in for quite a while. And so I started a company called Alverita AI. And the idea behind it is we use AI to do something unique. We structure. We don't generate content for you. In fact, that's a really critical differentiation between how Alverita works and how a lot of other things work. In essence, what we do is we take all of your body of work. So I can take videos of me doing public talks. I can take things like this, audio clips for me being on podcasts. I can take personal writings. I can take all the book components, speeches, everything I've written, and I can upload it to the system. And what the system does is it analyzes it and structures it. So what it really is it's this very, very advanced structure engine. It understands learning theory. It understands pedagogy, and it understands this concept of progression of knowledge. And so what it actually can do is it takes all of your content, and through some steps I'm going to be a little lightweight on right now, just because there's some intellectual property tied up into it. It converts that into a dynamic training program. And when you add to that some modern things we can do with AI, such as voice cloning through a place like 11 Labs or others that do voice cloning, potentially even using technologies that you see from companies like HeyGen that are actually cloning of individuals or creating avatars of individuals, you can then create an environment where I appear to be the person teaching you, except the dynamic nature of it means that you don't have to traverse through the program step 1, step 2, step 3, steps 4. If there's something that's interesting to you, you can move to that. The system can automatically understand if there's prerequisite knowledge within that course that maybe you haven't learned yet. And it can say, hey, I know I want to learn about this, but let's talk about these 3 things first that'll help you understand that better. And all of that's being done in, let's say, my voice. It's me. And then with a later version, it'll be me and an avatar of me being able to deliver that. And so what the platform then becomes is a place for creators who want to scale what they have and what they know to a broader audience to be able to do that in an easy way. But what it does for the users is it allows the users access to this marketplace of real expertise, people who can cover everything from career guidance all the way through to it could be how to be more emotional in what you do. It can be how to pursue your passions. Any topic you can think of that can be self-development, professional development, perhaps. You can pull into the platform, and then as a subscriber, you can then access all of these experts, and you get to learn from these experts in a way that maybe is not normally available to you. Perhaps you can't go to their seminars. Perhaps you can't get to one of their public appearances. Perhaps you're limited to just watching the occasional YouTube video clip, but this gives you like a very real, very personalized experience. And again, no generated content. It's all structuring content that's already there and just putting it in a form that makes it easy for people to learn from.
And so when you say there's no generated content and it's only structured, does that mean that if I'm talking to you, in this case, your clone or the version of you within this environment, and I ask a question that it doesn't have information on, the answer is going to be, I don't have information on that. I don't know. It's not
That's
going
right.
to hallucinate. It's not going to make stuff up. It's
No.
going to, okay. That's cool.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
but I think there's a unique aspect to this this is where a bit of the magic goes, and we're starting to tiptoe into IP. But I think this is an interesting component of it that I'm happy to talk about, which is when we do the analysis, the system that does the analysis, what it does is it might feel as if certain topics are talked about, but not at the level of detail needed. So if we're missing content, and through analysis, the system determines it's missing content, it doesn't generate it. Instead, what it generates is a task list for the person who uploaded the content. So for the expert, and it allows them to then go through that task list and address the gaps. And they can address the gaps. The system is built around this really simple method of addressing the gaps. It can be within the system itself. You hit the little mic button and you just record your bits of the gaps that are missing, each one. That gets transcoded, obviously, into text, and then gets processed by the system and added to the educational content or the learning content. Or you could just grab your phone and record yourself talking, or you might have another speech somewhere that you're about to give and you're going to address that, or you might have some writing somewhere. So it doesn't create content. It asks you to create the content in your voice that's missing. Now, over time, what it will begin to collect is if people veer off into topics that maybe are closely related and enough people do, you can see that. You can see as a expert that, hey, people are asking these questions and I may not have this covered in this content, and you can elect to add another module by just uploading additional content about it. Maybe it becomes the next thing you work on, but you get some intelligence out of this as to how people are interacting with your educational material and your learning material. You get feedback on the things that they're asking that may not be covered. You get that sort of feedback. So, and again, with that simple system of being able to add additional content by just clicking a microphone button and talking about whatever it is that's missing, what we're trying to do is make it easy to keep content in your voice and focus really just on how it's structured, and then using that optimal structure, how it can be delivered.
That's awesome. Tell me if I'm seeing this correctly, but it seems like it's a signal for someone, a consumer signal, a demand signal, right? I mean, that's really cool. So tell me about, if you can, a little bit about some of the potential use cases that you see it. I mean, obviously there's strictly knowledge for, hey, like I'm talking with you, you have a lifetime of really unique experience. But yeah, I mean, what do you have any proposed use cases that you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I'm not trying to be cagey, but I'm trying to not be overly specific about the core, because if you can imagine just the solution pattern, because again, let's put our solution hats on for a moment. The solution pattern is, given a corpus of knowledge, which is just a collection of knowledge represented in whatever form it's represented in, but it constitutes a body of knowledge. Given a body of knowledge, any body of knowledge can be put through this system, and it becomes instructional content that's optimized for delivery. So while our first use case is building this site of expertise, where it's really about building a marketplace of experts and bringing people together around that, you could imagine how you could create specialized versions of learning on specialized topics. So let's take a weird one, but the IRS publishes new rules every year. And one of the things the IRS has to do is it has to make sure that tax preparers have all the information on the changes in tax law. And so they do put that out. It's a huge body of knowledge. It's boring, it's dry, it's not very interesting. And there's a cottage industry of people who take that content and turn it into educational content and then teach tax people that. Well, this has the ability potentially to take that body of knowledge, upload it, have it break it out and turn it into learning content. And you could create, let's say, a specialized site that's just for tax preparers who want to know this year's tax changes or this year's tax code.
That's cool.
And so it becomes very easy to take that core, because the power of the core is taking any corpus of knowledge, structuring it into optimally deliverable content. And there's a little bit of where the magic is and the intellectual property is how do you do that? But then you can deliver it to a customer base. And that's actually underneath the covers, the real intellectual property and the real thing that Alverita will be is Alverita will be the engine builder in the end, because when you think about this expertise marketplace, we can do that for any sort of body of knowledge. We can create custom one-off sites that are unique to a specific market need. And so it's the real power is in the engine of this. And there's two core components. So one, I talk a lot about the extraction. It's the extraction and the way that it models the extracted data. That's part one. But then the secondary part of it is how that extracted data becomes something that can be put forward in a voice. It doesn't have to be the voice of the author, but can be put forward with a voice, and allows people to interact with it in real time. So I can ask it questions and I get audio responses back. I can ask it questions verbally and it can respond back to me. And so that's really the magic of this is those two components become basically key solution patterns for, I've got at least 10 use cases that I personally am interested in seeing happen. I'm sure give it to a creative couple of people and a few people. I'm sure they can come up with even more than that.
This one wouldn't be real, but tell me if I'm understanding it right. So, I mean, effectively, if I wanted to dig up my old 1987 Encyclopedia Britannica, volume B, A or whatever, let's go volume A, it's right at the beginning, and plug that thing in, then effectively it could take that content, it could take that information and create learning content out of all of Encyclopedia Britannica A. Wow, that's cool.
Yes.
Okay.
Now the idea here, and this is where it gets important, is we want to be, a lot of our conversation I've talked about. I've basically been a creator of content for more or less my entire career. Before the term content creator was cool, I've been building intellectual property for companies and content forever. And I can tell you that gives me a very healthy respect for intellectual property rights around content, right? So, and I'm certainly taking your example as an example and not as literal, but I think this is an important point about this platform. Our goal is to not let people use other people's intellectual property to drive something. So the point is that you need to be the intellectual property owner.
Got it.
We do. I've got. It'll get more advanced than it is today, but we've got some checks in the system just to make sure that you're not uploading random plagiarized data. But the whole idea behind it is to really scale a creator's knowledge. And then over time, as there may be more open or public source or open source types of things, like for a good example is there's a tremendous amount of research knowledge that gets published with no, basically open source licenses, as an example. And if you are in the field, one of the things that's hard, think of it this way. Jeffrey, you and I are in tech. I'm going to suspect that we don't spend, hours an evening learning about the newest research on technology. I'm not talking about the cool stuff. The research. We don't read that because, well, maybe we do sometimes, but I'm just saying, generally speaking, people don't do that. But imagine if you could go into a site and all of that domain knowledge you have, all of that open source research is available to you in a forum that it can explain it to you in a pretty quick way. And instead of having to consume it by reading papers and stuff, you can just go in and interact. And even better, because you can direct which portion of the corpus of knowledge it's really giving you, you can ask questions about the things you care about and have it direct you just to the research on the things you care about. So when you think about what, I think we always have to be careful in the AI world, because AI has got such a reputation for using user-generated content without their permission and just scraping random sites without their knowledge. And that's not the goal. Our goal is to let people structure their content, or potentially to put structure around content that is open and available to everyone. So, that's what we want to do. We want to be respectful. We want to kind of honor, at least my roots as someone who's built intellectual property for companies for most of my career. We want to honor the people who create intellectual property. We want to protect their property, but we want to make it easier for them to scale themselves. That's the big value proposition.
I can see the value there for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for breaking that down. So I know it's sensitive with intellectual property, but I think you mentioned that you have some other things in the works with regards to IP. I think there are a couple of patents that have recently been awarded. You want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, over the years, one of the things that's troubled me for pretty much my career is just the complexity we see in organizations. And it's important to understand that complexity in an organization has a value, a cost, realistically, and roughly the estimates right now are it's about $5.2 trillion a year is what complexity costs organizations globally, and that's trillion with a T. So that's a big
It's a little
complexity
bit
is
of
a
a
big
number, yeah.
problem, very big problem. And the general shape of my patents are that I have patents on how to predict complexity growth in organizations. And so there's some techniques that I've worked on. This is not like I had a eureka moment. This is something I've worked on slowly for probably 20 plus years now to try to figure out how to model and how to think about. And I was fortunate that I was able to develop a mathematical basis for this, and I was able to create some test applications that showed that how it works. And was able to get patents on the methods that I have for doing this. And the equation itself I keep as trade secret. But what's fascinating about it is, in essence, if you know how to predict complexity growth, that means you can also intercept complexity growth, and you can potentially govern and reduce complexity growth. There's some interesting things that can be done temporally, which is there's some ways to reflect backwards, which is to potentially understand how the complexity you have was acquired, which is fascinating. So it's really a lot of that work and as much as Alverita uses a lot of that type of conceptual work on the underpinnings of how we do operations. So some of that underlies that, but this is something that will most likely be a second company I'll be working on. So my goal with Alverita is to get it stood up, get it moving, get the right people behind it to run with it. And then I will consider where I am and then consider moving on. I think this governor idea is fairly significant. It becomes, in terms of the way the patents are laid out, it becomes a pretty critical thing when you talk about automated AI swarms and things that have the ability to spawn themselves. And that's because someone has to govern it. Most systems we have that exist today are not fast enough at understanding if it's making a good or bad decision. So, so it has some applicability there as well.
That makes sense. That's super interesting, that idea of the governance around it, and help having a way to check whether or not a decision that's being made or information that's being shared is good or bad. Just for my own, excuse me, for my own awareness, so when you talk about complexity, like, how are you defining complexity? Like, what are there, can you say? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to think about it. I'll give you a way to think about it, which is interesting, which is if you take so I'm going to use fancy words, but let me try to explain my terms. So if we talk about a system, we're talking about a system.
Okay.
If we're talking about systems of systems, we're talking about a bunch of systems that collaborate together.
Okay.
So if that makes sense. So we had a system, which is just a system, systems of systems, multiple systems that collaborate together. And those systems that collaborate together, you can define a system as a socio-technical system, meaning that some systems are human-driven and some systems are machine-driven. So we have systems theory, we have systems of systems theory, and then we have this idea of within systems of systems. So once you have more than one system, you can model both the computer systems as well as the human systems and how they work. So one of the things to think about is something which is a negative, we call it a negative desire path. So think about this for a moment, which is like, you need to get something done. And there's a process for doing it. And you need to you know that there's reasons to do it the right way, but you also know the person that approves it. And, if you go and you're in a rush, and if you go ask the person that approves it to just go ahead and cut you one, do you a favor, do you a solid, and just let it through without you having to go through the process, that's a desire path. So that's not documented. It's not following the procedure. It's naive to why the procedure existed, and it creates this desired path. And the problem with desired paths are that they become tribal because they're undocumented. And so what happens over time is people lose an understanding as to how something happened because it went through a desire path and circumvented a proper system. And that has interesting echo effects. So when you do that, it echoes through the system. So because you did that, then that meant this system didn't get this. Without this, this system has this problem. So figuring out how to model that was sort of weirdly almost. I'm old enough that I can't say life's work, but boy, it's been a heck of a lot of time that I've worked on trying to figure that out. And so I was able to validate through some sources that I was able to build an equation around it. But the reason it's important is that that's how complexity grows. Like, let me give you some ripped from the headlines examples as to how this happens. Okay, ripped from the headlines examples. So let's take the major outages that have happened recently as of this conversation we're having. Say Cloudflare had an outage. Why? Well, they made a change to production that had an unintended consequence. We could argue, should they have made that change to production without testing it, or was their testing sufficient? Both of those answers is no. That was a desire path. They went around, most likely, the real processes they were supposed to follow, and they used a desire path, and that desire path resulted in complexity in the system, and the system itself actually tipped over. Okay, well, let's back up to Amazon and their most recent outage. Similar sort of things. Some code went in, maybe shouldn't have gone into production, went in through an alternative form instead of going in through the way it was supposed to go in, started having cascading effects throughout the system and took down the whole system. So that desire path led to a cascade, which resulted in the system going down. If we go back before that, I believe it was Microsoft that had one where someone just needed to make a quick change to a router and went in and basically screwed up the spanning trees and all of the other sort of stuff, and it just basically cascaded. And that one got outside of Microsoft and got into the internet because of the way some of that information is propagated. So now you've got potentially 3 outages caused by someone choosing a desire path, and that desire path creating complexity and echoes throughout the system. So the fun thing about complexity is it happens to everyone, and the other fun thing about complexity is the repercussions of it impact even the best run, most modern organizations that theoretically do everything right, because it doesn't take anything but that one little human error or a system to behave in a way that's unexpected that cause cascades through the system. And the biggest thing about complexity is ultimately you hit a critical mass point and complexity causes failures. And any system, complexity reaches a point and it's modelable to where it's going to cause a failure or a collapse. And so it's a big system. I think that was a longer explanation than what you asked for, but it's really saying, we're trying to help people understand. It's a little bit difficult for people to understand how complex complexity is. Ooh, there we go.
I like that.
I feel like that should be a T-shirt somewhere.
No, I think it makes sense. Tell me if I'm getting it. And I think I'm probably missing something, but if this is a general idea, it's when I heard you say, paraphrasing it is in my own. Probably, I'm going to try to explain it back to you. What I think I understood it to be is the complexity essentially would be anything that's not the optimal path forward is the complexity. Said differently, it's a measure of the unnecessary resistance in any organization.
It very, very much so. I think the way to think about it is there's a couple of things. One, we have processes. So if it circumvents a process or a procedure, that's a problem, because most of the time, not all the time, those processes or procedures exist for a reason. It could be governance, it could be oversight, it could be error prevention. There's a lot of reasons why they exist. So if you do that's a problem. The secondary thing is anything that creates sort of tribal pathways. And that just means like people just do it that way because someone else did it that way. And that's the challenge. That's what creates the complexity is it becomes tribal. It's not institutional knowledge. It's knowledge in a few people. So those two, I would say, are probably the 90% case for a lot of the type of complexity that exists. There's other complexity that can exist, and that's just simply, we call it sprawl. It's just, when you have multiple pathways to solve the same problem, then that injects unnecessary complexity and creates space for error to exist. And so that's the third one that happens quite a bit, which is, fragmentation, multiple pathways to accomplish the same thing that are different for unknown reasons, but probably shouldn't be different. So those three tend to be the killers in most organization. It's circumventing process. It's desire paths that propagate through the wild, and then it's just a lot of it has to do with making suboptimal decisions or in the moment decisions that don't take into account the totality of the system. That's why it's more important to think, we talk about systems. I can isolate a problem within a system and it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal.
Mhm.
But when I start to interconnect all the other systems, you start to realize that can echo very fast
Sure.
through multiple systems and create tremendous amounts of complexity off of something really simple. So every time someone says, yeah, I know we're supposed to be using this IDE, but I don't like it. I want to use that one instead. That creates a fragment. Is it bad? Context matters, but it could be.
Yeah.
But if someone says, you know what, I don't like this CI tool. I want my own CI tool. It's like, well, everything was instrumented in the other CI tool. How do we know that the new pathway, which is to use a CI tool to do CI, has all of the things that we designed in the first one and isn't a path that is less, even though it's considered an equal choice, but one path is correct and one path is suboptimal, right? So this happens everywhere. We find this, one thing I can say as someone who's been doing this for a very long time, it's rare for me to find a company that has complexity issues that also don't have some permissiveness around tool sprawl and the ability to do the same thing using whatever tool you feel like is most appropriate at any given time.
That's a good point.
But you don't, and so that's really what it's about. It's about that growth, typically through desire path. I call them desire paths because almost all of those are, I just want to do it this way because it's more advantageous, more expeditious, easier for me. But they're also the exact mindsets that cause complexity to spiral out of control within organizations.
And so what you come up with is a way to measure complexity effectively. And so then I think that by measuring it, then if you measure it, you can understand it. If you can understand it, then you can start mitigating it, solving against it, which is a huge savings.
If you can measure it, you measure it, you can understand it. If you can measure it and understand it, you can model it. And if you can measure it, understand it, and model it, you can potentially predict it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so not just that's super interesting. So not just solving what's already there, but looking forward and trying to how to avoid. I mean, that's what's the phrase around a penny of prevention or something like that. That makes a lot of sense because tell me if this is also right. You've done all the research here, but I'm guessing that with this complexity that you're measuring, as companies grow, that's going to grow, right along with it, at least equal to it, or maybe
100%.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense. Man.
Yes.
That's
so the idea potentially to say, because I can understand how it happens in org. So think of it, this is a bit of an ML problem. It's like if and I say this as someone who's working on this, is if I take your historical examples, systems are easier to get data from, but I can potentially through conversation understand how certain decisions were made and how certain paths were created historically. Let's say I understand that within an organization. Let's say I understand that within 10 organizations or 100 organizations, and I can use those models to model and make predictions of how complexity will grow based off of what we know and how complexity grows in organizations. Then I could build governance systems that can get ahead of where that complexity is likely to happen to try to prevent it from growing within an organization.
That's cool. When would you say, I mean, I can see the use case in, larger companies. When would you say a company should start looking at this?
Day one.
Really?
I mean, think, okay. So it's interesting. I've been, no joke, seriously considering writing a bit of a blog post on this, just because I think it's fascinating to me. So think about, well, maybe we'll put it in this context. So I work with a lot of clients, and I work with clients everywhere from mid-sized businesses with a lot of international or multinational companies. So I worked from, let's say, mid-sized companies through the largest enterprises in the world, literally.
Yeah.
And one of the things you realize, and I hate the term for it, but I'm gonna use it as much as I hate it. The marketing term technical debt is meant
Mhm.
to kind of imply that you have systems that are suboptimal that have just been brought along forever. I like the concept of it, but I hate the term because the term is really, therefore, if you know, put it in the cloud, everything's okay, and that's just simply not true. So let's maybe let's take that fallacy off the table today.
Okay.
But the important part about this is that, yeah, is that when you think about this and you think about this idea of I have these systems, you have systems that people created way back when. And what's happened is a lot of what went on in those systems way back in was tribal
Okay. Yeah.
or held within, so it's not documented. So now you have this interesting undocumented system that's existed, and somehow inevitably in every organization it ends up being a critical linchpin to some absolutely major business function that if it doesn't happen, the whole company has an existential crisis and dies. Okay, so maybe a little facetious, but the problem is that so many people are carrying temporary fixes,
Hmm.
this really quick workaround, or this thing we used to do that came up early on in their organizational development that you know 20 years later they still have never gone back and fixed. And
Yeah.
so
That's a good point.
it's I'm going to talk out of turn here just because I wish I had this more thought out, and this is why I've been thinking a lot about writing it. Is if you think about the philosophy of a startup, a lot of them are like, just get stuff out as fast as you can, you
Yeah.
know, fake it till you make it, do whatever, get it out there, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's really cool if you want to appeal to the VC markets and all these other sorts of things. And you want to sit in coffee shops with your headphones on and your stickers on your laptop and finger gun everybody. If you want to do that, that's awesome, man. Go ahead, knock yourself out. It's a wonderful approach to this. But the other approach is maybe I should start by making sure that I don't make future me absolutely miserable. So maybe I should document everything. Maybe the first thing you do when you start a startup is you create a set of architectural principles and standards so that everything is documented, all systems are understood, things work in a predictable way, you understand how to operate it, you understand how to secure it, you understand. Maybe, just maybe, the earlier you can do that so that things are in place, the more complexity you can prevent as the organization grows, because you've shaped it so that it does so in a predictable way, in a documented way, and in a consistent way, right? So I think the answer to your question is complexity is a problem almost immediately. In fact, I would say I talk to a lot of startup founders. I've advised multiple companies. I would say that most of them, by the second or third year, are already carrying a lot of complexity and weight that happened during the fast growth part of their early cycle, and that there's just no time to go back and fix. So it's interesting, and I think it takes having been in the industry for a while and seeing just the prevalence of people carrying old decisions that no one understood without really any reason, that creates all this complexity that you have to build around this old system that no one knows how to work just to try to keep things working, because there's no way to replace it, no way to get rid of it. So I don't want to make those errors myself. And I think that for most companies, if you're starting out, I think there's something to be said for taking the time to make sure that you're not creating issues that are going to exacerbate complexity. But don't take my word for that. You're going to hear, you know, a dozen Silicon Valley dudes tell you something completely different than that. But I think I could defend my point in front of most audiences.
I mean, look, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. The reality is, you know, I've never been a 20-year-old founder, but look, when you're younger, you haven't experienced those things. Like you said, you haven't seen those, uh, you just haven't had those experiences. And so there's some value in seeing it from, you know, someone who has seen it, and then you've seen it at all sorts of levels, to be able to to be able to understand, okay, there really is an impact here. And then to be able to have it modeled out so that, hey, if you're on that early side and you're thinking, okay, so someone tells me there's a problem, but I don't have the experience to solve it. At least if you can have a model to build around so that you can have a success. You know, you're talking about technical debt, and all debts carry, they carry an interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an interest with technical debt. When you go and talk to someone about taking out financial debt, they give you a model and they're like, hey, look, this is what it's going to cost you to take out a loan, yada, yada, yada. You go through the whole thing and you have to understand it, but no one explains that when you're working on an early technology project. There's going to be technical debt here. Here's what the cost is in terms of complexity. And I could totally see the value there of being able to understand it, just being like, at least you can make an informed decision. Sometimes it's the right decision to take out a loan.
Yep.
Sometimes it's not. So anyway, I love that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, workarounds have a tendency to stay in place far past their useful life. But even worse, see, it's sort of like, think of it this way. And this is a stupid example, but just bear with me on it. If I have a freeway and for some reason it Ys, then because of that Y, even if that Y was stupid, maybe they had to Y around a natural feature because they didn't have the time to go straight through it. By it being like that, other systems are going to spring up around it. And so all of a sudden, all these other things have sprung up around it. And now you're like, okay, well, this sucks. This adds, this split adds 20 minutes of time to everyone's drive. It's terrible. Now we have the ability to make it straight. We can go straight through, saving people massive amounts of money. But wait a minute. Now you've got businesses, maybe towns, ecosystems that have all sprung up around that workaround you put in place. And so now you want to get rid of the workaround and it will have positive benefits except it impacts those other systems now because, and by the way, those other systems, they're not really optimal. They're not great. They're never going to be really that good because of the way that they've had to be. And by split, I'm thinking like the northbound lanes go this way and the southbound lanes come around this way, right? So it's not like you have a city that serves both sides. You have a city that serves one side, a city that serves the other side, blah, blah, blah. Now they're the same. What happens to these? What happens to the elements that were put into place to compensate for the workaround?
Yeah.
And that's what people fail to understand is it's not just that the workaround impacts things. It's that the systems that build up around the workarounds make it so that the workarounds become nearly impossible to get rid of. And you go to any Fortune 500 that exists in this world today, and I will put money on the table that you will find those systems in that organization. And if you only find one, they're special. You will find multiple systems there. So the question becomes, if you're starting a company, do you want to avoid that trap or not? Because any time you make a suboptimal decision, a workaround decision, other things are going to grow around the workaround that are going to make it harder to get back to the correct way to do something, or the optimal. Let's not say correct, the optimal way to do something. So yeah, it's a problem even, and I think people feel like go fast, break things. That's okay, and it can be, but if you're not careful, you end up with remnants and workarounds, which creates artificial complexity.
I can see it. Like, have you thought about what percentage of that you think you could plan for? Obviously, well, let me rephrase this. I would guess that it's going to be unlikely that you can plan for 100% optimal decisions. I mean, there's always going to be outliers, things you can't plan for. No, you can.
No, you can't. You can't. It's not possible.
Yeah.
No, you will always approach perfect, but I don't think you ever get there in optimization. I mean, I could probably, mathematics would probably tell you something slightly different, but I think that in reality is you approach optimization, but you don't always reach optimization. And that's because there's new things coming into play that are always going to act on things that are going to cause things to pull slightly out of optimization. So you're in a constant battle for optimization. So
makes sense.
It's a bit of an interesting challenge, I think.
It is, but I mean, thinking back to the first number that you talked about, is something in the trillions, and even if you want to take a small piece of that and optimize, a piece of it, like that's a huge win. So
Yeah, it,
I
it
love that.
is, and that's the way I think about it. I think of it as it's a compelling problem. It's an enormous market problem. Um, the technology is starting to be there to make this a real thing, to actually get to the point. So some of this is based on that ability to collect that data, to
Hmm.
build those models. I've done some baselines on them, but really, you can imagine that this becomes something that becomes that is linchpin critical for most organizations, because if you have the ability to, one, find complexity and reverse it out, figure out how it grew, so you can get back to some of those decisions that were made and potentially eliminate it, but even better, if you could prevent it from happening in the future, um, then not only do you lower that cost of complexity, but you maintain that reduced cost over time, and that's probably more interesting than simply a one-time reduction in complexity.
Yeah. I don't know if this is maybe part of the IP. If you can talk about this, that's okay. Or even if you can, it's cool. If you can, it's even great. But I was thinking about, workarounds in general. I feel like they tend to be situations where something is going to be taken out of the normal process. So they're a little bit harder to identify and measure. Um, so I don't know. How do you like, how do you do that? I mean, how do you identify them?
Analysis and questions. I mean, some of it is,
Yeah,
the most fascinating thing to me. I mean, if I was king of a big Fortune 500,
sure.
just to say it, I think the first thing I would realize is that the best thing I can do right now is go find my tribal pockets and start documenting the hell out of how
Mm,
that evolved, because temporarily we lose that information so fast. When employee leaves who knew the history and they're gone, and now no one knows how it happened, right? So
yeah.
I think a lot of that's there, but I also I say this anecdotally with some expertise. I see this same patterns over and over and over again with organizations, to the point where it's not hard to figure out where the challenges are in most organizations, just because they're going to fall into some standard classes of problems, and so that means that you can potentially train things knowing that these are the typical causal problems or the typical problems. And so there's some things you can do just from a modeling perspective and potentially from a machine learning perspective to help uh, predict where those things are likely to happen based off of past occurrences. Their emergent patterns are pretty. That's the thing I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail on, but let's just say that the emergent patterns are more common than people realize, and understanding how they happen and being able to collect more data on their occurrences and the patterns that cause them to emerge is a critical part of the research side of the work that I'm working on there.
So for people who are listening to this that are pretty excited about this, but can hear that, not everything's quite ready to be fully public yet. When do you think those things will be ready when you can have like a full conversation about it with folks?
Well, Alverita's the big thing. For me, it's getting Alverita up, running, launched. And then I do feel that it's something that I will, yeah, I'm fortunate to have been in the business as long as I have. I know people who I would trust to take over large portions of what Alverita does over time. And so I have a good Rolodex there. Um, I am most interested in fact, if this happens to reach an academic organization, I'm very interested in a public-private partnership on research on this. And so over time, that's probably my most immediate pursuit, potentially in parallel with Alverita, is to form a public-private partnership with a university who wants to work on this specifically and help to commercialize this. I think the implications are fairly large, and I will say that most of the academic crowd that I've shown the equation, some of the concepts to, have been pretty overwhelmingly positive about. Wow, this is an interesting way to think about this problem. So I feel good about that part.
It's
So
exciting.
again, if you're a major research university and you're looking for research partnerships, and you want to do a public-private partnership, let's talk.
You never know. You just never know,
You never
right?
know.
Well, I'm glad you put
No.
it out there. Well, this has been
Yeah.
awesome, man. I really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Thanks for, giving us all the rundown, and anything we didn't cover that you want to cover?
I think we've done a good job of hitting probably more than I even thought we were going to hit. So this is awesome, Jeff. Thanks for that.
Oh man, thank you. I really appreciate it. And